He left the battlefield to save his daughter from growing up without a father. He buried his weapons, his instincts, and the man he used to be somewhere beneath grocery lists and school pickups and the quiet ache of a house that used to have more laughter in it. For 3 years, Nolan Cross kept his promise to himself. No more fighting, no more blood, no more war. Then a woman screamed in the dark, and every instinct he'd spent 3 years trying to kill came back in under 4 seconds. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous thing a man can do is love someone enough to become something he swore he'd never be again, stay with me until the very end. Hit like on this video and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down the way Seattle rain always did in November. Not in dramatic sheets the way it did in the movies, but in that low, relentless drizzle that soaked through your jacket before you realized it was doing anything at all. It was the kind of rain that didn't announce itself. It just settled in, quiet and persistent, and made everything gray. Nolan Cross walked with his head slightly down, 2 canvas grocery bags hanging from his left hand, and a gallon of whole milk tucked against his ribs with his right arm. He had exactly 11 blocks between himself and the apartment. He'd counted them enough times that the number lived in him automatically, the way distances always had, the way he'd once counted paces in 100 different environments where miscounting could kill you. He wasn't in those environments anymore. He reminded himself of that sometimes, still, after 3 years. You're in Seattle. You're going home. The only thing waiting for you is a 7-year-old who's going to ask you whether you remembered the syrup. And you did. It's in the left bag next to the coffee. And tomorrow morning she's going to eat pancakes and get it on her shirt, and you're going to pretend to be annoyed, and you won't be. He was 32 years old, and he worked for a company called Cascadia Appliance Repair, and he drove a white van with the company logo on the side. And on weekdays, he fixed dishwashers and washing machines and refrigerators in people's houses. And on weekends, he took Ellie to the park or to the library or to the small Vietnamese place on Boren Avenue where she liked the spring rolls. It was a small life. He'd built it deliberately small. The neighborhood he walked through wasn't bad exactly, but it wasn't good either. It was that in-between kind of Seattle that tourists didn't photograph, the part where the old warehouses had been converted into something or other, and the coffee shops were still mostly functional rather than aesthetic. There were always people around during the day. At 8:15 on a Tuesday evening in November, there were almost none. He turned left off of Pike onto a side street he usually cut through to avoid the longer route. Halfway down, between a closed printing shop and what had once been a convenience store and was now plywood and a city permit notice, there was an alley entrance. He didn't slow down when he heard the first sound. It was faint enough that most people wouldn't have registered it as anything, a scuff, a sharp exhale, something that might have been wind-moving debris. But Nolan's ears caught what his brain had already flagged, because even 3 years of groceries and school pickups and dishwasher parts hadn't been enough to make him stop listening the way he'd been trained to listen. He heard the space between sounds. He heard what should have been there and wasn't. He stopped walking. Then he heard the voice. A woman's voice, low and cut short, the kind of sound that comes from someone who's been grabbed and is trying not to make it obvious, or has already learned that making it obvious doesn't help. Nolan set the grocery bags down on the sidewalk against the building wall without thinking about it. The milk went down next to them. He didn't think about what he was doing in any conscious, deliberate way. His body had already made the decision before the part of his brain that worried about things like this could raise an objection. He moved into the alley. What? There were 3 of them. They were not sophisticated. He registered that within the first second, not with relief, but with the cold, focused clarity that had never really left him, even when he'd wanted it to. 2 of them were positioned badly. One had his back partially to the entrance, which was either arrogance or inexperience, and the other was too far from his partner to provide useful coverage in a confined space. The third had a grip on a woman's arm and was saying something in a low, urgent voice that had the cadence of a demand being repeated. The woman was on her feet, but only barely. There was something dark on the side of her face, wet against her temple, and she was clutching a laptop bag against her chest with her free arm like it was the only thing she was sure of. She was small, dark-haired, and she was not crying. That registered clearly. She was not crying. She was furious and terrified in equal measure, and she was calculating something. He could see it in the set of her jaw, even from 12 feet away in the dark. And whatever she was calculating, It was not surrender. "Hey," Nolan said. Not loudly, not aggressively, just the word, dropped into the alley the way you might drop a stone into water to see what moved. All three men turned. The one holding the woman didn't let go. "Walk away," said the one closest to Nolan. He was broad, confident, wearing a jacket that was a size too large in the way people sometimes wore things when they wanted extra room for things they were carrying. "This doesn't involve you." "She doesn't want to be here," Nolan said. He was looking at the man, but his attention was already distributed. Left, right, the wall behind him, the distance to the third man near the woman. "So it kind of does." "You have about 3 seconds to make a smarter decision." Nolan moved at 1. A pishkem. He was not a large man in the way that people imagined when they imagined someone who could do what he did. He was 6 feet even, lean rather than bulked, with the kind of build that comes from functional training over years rather than a gym trying to look like something. He'd never fought to look impressive. He'd fought to end things. It was over in slightly under 90 seconds. The first man went down from a strike that broke his engagement and put him into the wall hard enough that he didn't come back from it, not in any useful sense. The second one had a knife and knew how to use it, which meant he'd done this before, which meant the next 15 seconds were complicated. Nolan caught a cut across his left forearm that he felt as pressure and heat before he felt it as pain, and he ended the encounter by taking the weapon out of the equation in a way that was not gentle. The third one, the one who'd been holding the woman, made the smart decision and ran. Nolan let him run. He wasn't here to chase anyone. He stood for a moment in the alley while the rain came down and his arm throbbed, and the two men on the ground made the sounds of people who were conscious but not interested in further engagement. The woman was staring at him. "Are you hurt?" he said. She blinked. Her hand came up to the side of her face, touched the blood at her temple, seemed to register it as information rather than cause for alarm. "My head. I hit the wall when they grabbed me." She looked at his arm. "You're bleeding." "Little bit," he agreed. He looked at the two men on the ground, then back at her. "They're going to be there for a few minutes. You should tell me if there's somewhere safe I can take you." She opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved across her face that wasn't easy to read. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. It was more like she was trying to figure out whether trading one unknown man for 3 known threats was a calculation that made sense. She started. "I don't have anywhere right now." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "Okay," he said. "Then you're coming with me." "Right." She told him her name while he was picking up his grocery bags from the sidewalk. Just the first name offered carefully, like she was testing whether he'd react to it. "Avery." "Nolan," he said. He handed her the lighter of the 2 bags, not asking whether she wanted to carry it, just giving her something to hold that might make walking next to a stranger feel slightly less strange. "You hit your head hard enough that I want to make sure you're not concussed. You know what day it is?" "Tuesday." "What month?" "November. I know what year it is, too, if that's the next question." "Good." He adjusted the milk under his arm. "The apartment's 6 blocks. Can you walk?" She walked. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had probably been nice in the late 90s and had since settled into something more functional than attractive. The elevator worked about 70% of the time. Tonight was not part of that percentage, which meant they took the stairs, which meant Nolan got to notice that Avery was favoring her left side more than she'd let on. He unlocked the door and pushed it open and didn't warn her about what she was going to find, because there wasn't time, because Ellie was already in the hallway. She was 7 years old and she was wearing pajamas with cartoon dinosaurs on them, and she was holding a stuffed rabbit that she'd had since she was 2 and technically had a name, Biscuit, though she only used it when talking to the rabbit directly. She had dark eyes, hair that Nolan could never quite get to cooperate no matter what products the woman at the pharmacy had recommended, and the expression of someone who had been planning to be asleep but had heard the door and made an executive decision. "You're late," she said to Nolan. Then she looked at Avery, then back at Nolan. "Who's that?" "This is Avery," Nolan said, setting the bags down and moving to the kitchen. "She's going to stay for a little while. She got hurt." Ellie looked at Avery with the frank, assessing attention of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude. Then she looked at the blood on Avery's temple. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Avery, who had been holding herself with a kind of careful composure since the alley, looked down at this small person in dinosaur pajamas and seemed to recalibrate something. "A little," she said. "Biscuit fell off the bed last week and hit his head," Ellie said, apparently finding this relevant. "I put a bandage on him even though there wasn't really a cut. It still helped." Something shifted in Avery's expression. It wasn't dramatic, just a small softening around the eyes, the kind that happens when someone says something that catches you off guard by being kind when you weren't expecting it. "That sounds like exactly the right thing to do," she said. Nolan cleaned the cut on her temple at the kitchen table while Ellie was, theoretically, going back to bed. In practice, Ellie reappeared twice, once for a glass of water that she absolutely did not need, and once to offer Avery her second favorite stuffed animal, a flattened bear named Charles, in case Avery wanted company during the night. Avery accepted Charles with a seriousness that matched Ellie's own, and Nolan didn't say anything about the fact that the stuffed animal was now sitting on the table next to the first aid kit. "Hold still," he said, pressing the gauze more firmly. "The cut's not deep enough to need stitches, but it's going to hurt tomorrow." "It already hurts," she said. "Yeah." The kitchen was quiet except for the rain on the window and the occasional sound from the hallway that suggested Ellie was approximately as asleep as Nolan was convinced she was, which was not very. "You did that very quickly," Avery said. "In the alley." "Did what quickly?" "All of it." He didn't respond to that. He applied the bandage, pressed the edges down, checked the adhesion. "Military?" she asked. "Navy," he said. "A while ago." She was watching him with the kind of attention that wasn't casual, the focused, evaluating kind, the look of someone who was used to reading people and doing it well. "How long have you been fixing appliances?" 3 years. "Why?" He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching. "Because my daughter needed someone who came home," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, I'm sorry for involving you in whatever this is." "You didn't involve me. I walked into it." Still. He stood up, gathered the gauze and the wrappers, moved to the trash. "You should sleep. You've got a head injury, and it's almost 9 o'clock. He pulled a blanket from the cabinet above the washer. "The couch is serviceable. Bathroom's through there. I'll check on you in a couple hours to make sure you haven't developed any alarming symptoms." "Alarming symptoms," she repeated. "Concussion signs. Confusion, vomiting, unequal pupils." He set the blanket on the couch. "You can lock the door from the inside. I'd recommend it." She was watching him from the kitchen doorway. "You don't want to know what's going on?" It wasn't a question. She said it like it was a puzzle piece she was trying to locate. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you're safe and your head needs rest. Tomorrow's different." He said goodnight and went to check on Ellie, who was very convincingly pretending to be asleep. Nolan sat on the edge of his daughter's bed for a few minutes after she'd stopped pretending and actually drifted off, which happened faster than it usually did, the way it sometimes did when the day had been unusual enough to exhaust the part of her brain that usually kept sleep at bay. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her every night for the past 3 years, with the particular exhausted, fierce, inarticulate love that he'd never found adequate words for and had stopped trying to. Her mother had been gone for 2 years now. Not dead. He was always careful with himself about that distinction, not out of sentimentality, but out of accuracy. Dana had left. She'd left when Ellie was 5 and Nolan was back from his 4th deployment, and they were both different people than they'd married, and staying had not seemed possible to either of them in the ways that mattered. It had been ugly in its way these things were always ugly, and then it had been over, and now Ellie spent most of the year with him, and 1 month in the summer with Dana in Portland. And it was not a perfect arrangement. It was just the one they had. He went to bed at 11. He set an alarm for 1 in the morning and another for 3 to check on Avery, the way he'd have checked on anyone with a head injury in his care. He lay in the dark and listened to the rain and the building's particular nighttime sounds, the pipes, the neighbor above who kept strange hours, the distant sound of a car doing something inadvisable on the wet street below. He thought about the man who'd run, the third one, the one he'd let go. He thought about the way Avery had held that laptop bag against her chest, even when she'd been afraid and hurt and alone in an alley with three strangers. Not her wallet, not her phone, the laptop. He thought about the word wherever, the careful, deliberate use of it. I don't have anywhere right now. Not, I don't have a place right now. Which meant there was somewhere she normally had, and she didn't currently have access to it, which meant something had gone wrong in a specific way rather than a general one. He thought about all of this and didn't do anything with any of it, because it was late, and his arm ached where the cut had been cleaned and bandaged, and tomorrow was a Wednesday, which meant Ellie had school at 8:15, and he had a service call in Ballard at 9:30 for a front-load washer, making a noise the customer described as like a goat, but mechanical, and you couldn't fix anything properly if you were operating on 4 hours of sleep. He turned over and closed his eyes and made himself stop thinking. Oh, she was awake when he checked at 1, sitting up on the couch with the lamp on low, the laptop open on her knees, her face in the blue-white glow of whatever she was looking at. She closed it quickly when he opened the bedroom door, which told him something. Any dizziness? Nausea? No. Headache? Yes, but a normal one. I know what a normal headache feels like. He nodded. Okay, you should actually try to sleep. I know. She didn't move to lie down. He leaned against the doorframe. Is there someone I should call? Family? Friend? Anyone? The pause before she answered was long enough to be its own answer. No. Is whoever those men were going to know where you are? They don't know where I am, she said. They know where I was. I haven't been staying anywhere long enough for them to establish a pattern. He processed that. Long enough to establish a pattern was not how someone talked about being in trouble for a day or two. That was someone who'd been managing a threat for a while, someone who understood how tracking worked. How long? He said. She looked at him. 10 days. Moving every day? Every 1 or 2. He nodded slowly. You're good at it. Something complicated crossed her face. Not quite pride, not quite the opposite. I used to think I was good at a lot of things, she said. Turns out some of them don't work as well as I thought. He didn't ask what that meant. Get some sleep, he said. The couch is comfortable enough for a few hours. We can talk in the morning when Ellie's at school. He closed the door. Well, at the 3 o'clock check, she was asleep, the laptop tucked under the couch cushion beside her in a way that suggested she'd done that deliberately, the way you might sleep with your hand near something important. Charles the bear was on the armrest. He turned off the lamp she'd left on and went back to bed. In the morning, there was chaos of the routine kind. Ellie woke up and remembered and came barreling into the living room in her dinosaur pajamas before Nolan had even started the coffee, and the next 15 minutes involved a conversation about whether Avery wanted to see Ellie's drawings from art class. She did. Whether Avery had a favorite color, she said green. Ellie noted this with the gravity of someone cataloging important data. And whether Avery had ever had dinosaurs as a topic of extensive personal interest, she had not, which Ellie appeared to consider a correctable oversight rather than a fundamental incompatibility. Nolan made coffee and eggs and managed to get Ellie mostly dressed and her backpack mostly packed, and her out the door at 8:10, which was 5 minutes behind his preferred schedule but within acceptable parameters. He walked her to the corner where the school bus picked up, stood in the November morning with his hands in his jacket pockets, watched the bus pull away, and then walked back to the apartment. Avery was standing in the kitchen with a mug of the coffee she'd poured herself, wearing the same clothes as yesterday because there wasn't anything else yet, her dark hair damp. She'd used the shower, which he'd told her to, and the bandage on her temple looking clean and properly adhered. She looked tired, which made sense. She looked like someone who'd been operating on some combination of adrenaline and sheer force of will for 10 days and was becoming aware of the cost of that. She's wonderful, Avery said when he came in, a simple statement not performed. She is, he agreed. He got himself a mug. Are you ready to tell me what's happening? She looked at him over her coffee. Then she set the mug down, pulled the laptop from where she'd left it on the couch, opened it on the kitchen table, and sat down. Sit down, she said. It's going to take a few minutes. Her name was Avery Monroe. He'd heard the name in the way you heard the names of people who were in the news, Not well, not in detail, just the ambient awareness of someone who existed at a level of visibility that occasionally penetrated even the life of someone who didn't particularly follow business news. CEO of Monroe Holt Technologies, a company that had started as a cybersecurity consultancy 7 years ago and had grown into something considerably larger, valued at something in the billions of dollars that he couldn't have quoted precisely. The name of the company was Monroe Holt because there had originally been two founders, Avery Monroe and a man named Damian Holt. "We built it together," she said, and the flatness in her voice when she said it was not the flatness of someone who felt nothing. It was the flatness of someone who had felt a great deal and had needed, for the sake of functioning, to set most of it aside. 6 years. He was the operations side, I was the technical and strategic side. It worked. For a long time, it actually worked. She had discovered, approximately 5 weeks ago, a series of financial anomalies in the company's accounts. Small ones, initially, the kind that could have been errors, and that she'd almost written off as errors until one of them led her to another, and that one to another. And what she'd eventually found, after 3 weeks of pulling at threads in her own time and on her own equipment, was a structured embezzlement operation that had been running for approximately 18 months. Millions of dollars, moved in amounts and through intermediaries that were designed to look like legitimate business expenses. Consulting fees, licensing costs, overseas partnerships that didn't fully exist. All of it led back to Damian. "He needed the money," she said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. The company was doing well, we were both doing well. He didn't need it, and I still don't fully understand why he—" She stopped, her jaw tightened. "That's not the point. The point is what happened when I confronted him." What had happened was not what she'd expected. She'd expected denial, initially, then perhaps some version of negotiation. What she'd gotten was something considerably worse. Damian had been prepared. He'd had lawyers present within 48 hours who had filed a preemptive claim with the company's board alleging that Avery had been the source of the financial irregularities. He'd had documentation, forged, she was certain, but sophisticated enough to require forensic analysis to definitively disprove. He'd moved to have her access to company systems suspended pending an internal investigation. Within a week, she'd been effectively locked out of her own company. "The laptop," Nolan said. "The laptop," she confirmed. "I had already copied everything I found onto an encrypted drive and onto this. Transaction records, communications. There are messages. Ones he didn't know I had access to because I'd built a shadow logging system into the communications platform 2 years ago for security monitoring purposes, and I never told him it existed because it was—" She paused. "Because it was a liability thing. Not because I suspected him. I just wanted coverage if we were ever subject to a regulatory inquiry. I never thought—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I never thought I'd use it to protect myself from him." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "The men in the alley. He's used private contractors before. Security consultants. Some of them operate in a gray area." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think they were supposed to kill me. I think they were supposed to get the laptop. But last night," something shifted in her expression. "Last night felt like a different kind of directive." "Did you go to the police?" The look on her face was complicated and not quite bitter. "I did, early on. The problem is that Damian has relationships with people who have relationships with people. I don't have proof that anyone in law enforcement has been interfered with. But twice when I thought I'd found a safe place to stay and told someone I trusted, someone who knew how to reach me, I had to move within 24 hours because someone showed up who shouldn't have known where I was." Nolan absorbed this. He looked at the laptop, at the woman across the table, at the coffee cooling in his mug. "So you can't trust the information chain," he said. "I can't trust most of it, no. And the evidence on the laptop, is it enough?" "For the board, yes, unambiguously. It's forensic-level documentation. If I can get in front of the board with this, the case is clear." She leaned back. "The problem is getting in front of the board. Damian controls access through the current acting CEO, who is his appointment. He's been managing the narrative, telling people I'm unstable, paranoid, that the stress of the investigation triggered something. She pressed her lips together. "He's very good at this. I didn't understand how good until recently." What's your timeline? The board has a scheduled meeting in 12 days. If I'm not there, if I don't make my case before then, they'll ratify a set of structural changes to the company that will make it significantly harder to challenge the current management. He's stalling, essentially, buying himself enough time to make this permanent. Nolan looked at her for a long moment. You've been running for 10 days, he said. Hotel lobbies, moving around, trying not to stay visible. Yes. And it almost ended last night. She didn't argue with that. He stood up, took his mug to the sink, stood looking out the small window at the November gray of the parking lot below. He thought about the fact that he had a service call in Ballard in 45 minutes. He thought about the fact that whatever this woman was carrying, she'd been carrying it alone for 10 days, and she was still sharp and still tactical and still fighting, which meant she had reserves that most people didn't, and which also meant she'd been running on those reserves long enough that they were no longer reliable. He thought about Ellie asking Avery her favorite color in the early morning living room light, and the way something in Avery's face had shifted, briefly, into something that looked like a person remembering what it felt like to just be a person rather than a problem to be solved. He turned around. You can stay here, he said. For now. She looked at him carefully. That's not a small offer. Given what I just told you, you understand that... I understand what it means, he said. I'm not confused about it. They'll look here. If they track me, if they figure out what alley they lost me in, let me worry about that. She stared at him. Why would you do this? He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things. Not because it was simple, and not because he was a good person in any uncomplicated sense, and not because of anything as clean as a moral code. He thought about it because it was the real question, and she deserved a real answer. Because you walked out of that alley holding a laptop instead of your phone, he said. Because you've been fighting a careful, intelligent battle for 10 days by yourself, and you're still thinking clearly, which means whatever you're carrying is worth carrying. And because my daughter offered you Biscuit's backup stuffed animal within 10 minutes of meeting you, and Ellie's instincts are better than mine. Avery looked at him. Something in her face went through several adjustments. None of them performed. Charles? She said finally. What? The bear. His name is Charles. I know what his name is, Nolan said. I've lived with him for 3 years. He picked up his jacket. I have a service call. I'll be back by noon. Don't answer the door and don't open the windows past the first latch. There's food in the fridge and you can use anything in the apartment. He was at the door when she said, Nolan. He turned. Thank you, she said. Not elaborately, just the 2 words, plainly. Don't thank me yet, he said. We've got 12 days. He closed the door behind him. The washing machine in Ballard was, as advertised, making a sound that was difficult to categorize, but which Nolan diagnosed within 10 minutes as a failing drum bearing. A known issue with this particular model, fixable, requiring a part he had in the van. He worked steadily and without thinking about the apartment he'd left, because working without thinking was something he was genuinely good at. One of the things the years had actually given him that translated cleanly into a life that didn't require anyone to get hurt. The bearing replacement took 45 minutes. The customer, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who had opinions about the machine's manufacture that she shared at length and without prompting, paid him in cash and offered him a cookie from a tin on the counter. He took the cookie. He drove back to Seattle. He sat in the van outside his building for a moment before going up. 12 days. A woman alone in a city with an enemy who had resources and time and motivation, carrying evidence that could end a career and possibly a freedom, with a board meeting she had to reach, and a way of reaching it that she hadn't yet found. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was an appliance technician. He had a 7-year-old who liked spring rolls and had strong opinions about dinosaurs. He got out of the van and went upstairs. The apartment smelled like fresh coffee. Avery had made a second pot. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open and a legal pad beside it covered in handwriting. Organized, precise handwriting, the kind that suggested she'd been working steadily since he left. She looked up when he came in. I've been thinking about the board access problem, she said, without preamble. There are 2 board members who predate Damien's influence. I know both of them personally. If I could get a message to one of them directly, not through company channels, I might be able to arrange a private presentation before the formal meeting. He sat down across from her. He looked at the legal pad. Show me what you have, he said. Outside, the November rain had finally stopped. Somewhere across the city, in a school with a lot of noise in the hallways, and a teacher who was explaining the water cycle for the second time, a 7-year-old was drawing something that would later turn out to be a picture of a woman with dark hair and a bandage, standing next to a man with a smaller person beside him, under a sky full of something that was either stars or very large raindrops, depending on who was looking. Ellie labeled it "My Family" now and gave it to Avery that afternoon, without ceremony, the way children give things. Like the value was self-evident and didn't need explaining. Avery put it in the front pocket of the laptop bag. She didn't take it out again. The legal pad had 4 pages covered by the time Nolan had poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat down properly to look at it. Avery's handwriting was small and consistent, the kind that came from someone who'd spent years taking notes in meetings where showing uncertainty wasn't an option. She'd organized what she had into 3 columns: evidence categories, potential access points to board members, and a third column she'd titled Gaps, which was the longest of the 3. "Walk me through it," he said. She turned the pad so he could read it more easily, which he did, and then she talked for 20 minutes without stopping, explaining the evidence architecture the way an engineer explains a structure, not to impress, but to make sure whoever was listening understood exactly where the load-bearing elements were and what happened if any of them failed. He asked 2 questions. She answered both without defensiveness, adjusting her explanation where she realized it had been unclear. When she finished, he said, "The 2 board members you mentioned, tell me about them." Gerald Foss, 63, been on the board since the company's 2nd year. He's careful, conservative, and he doesn't like Damien. I knew that long before this happened. They've clashed on strategic decisions more than once. She tapped her pen against the pad. And Patricia Ewan, she came on about 2 years ago. Technology background, she actually understands what the company does. She's harder to read than Gerald, but she's not political the way some of the others are. Do either of them have a direct line that Damien doesn't monitor? That's the problem I've been working on all morning. She leaned back in the chair. Gerald has a personal email he uses for non-company correspondence. I have it. Whether Damien has someone watching it, I don't know. Patricia. I'd have to reach through a third party. There's a mutual contact, a woman named Sonia, who used to work at my previous company and now consults independently. She's outside the Monroe Holt ecosystem entirely. And you trust her? More than anyone else I can think of right now, which is a low bar, but it's honest. Nolan looked at the gap column. What about the board meeting date? Is it fixed, or can Damien move it? Avery frowned. He could theoretically move it, but it would require 2/3 board agreement, and moving it would look suspicious. The current date serves his purposes as long as I don't appear. So he needs you either gone or discredited by day 12. Yes. Nolan was quiet for a moment, working through it the way he'd worked through logistics in environments considerably more chaotic than a Seattle apartment kitchen, where the variables were at least nameable even if they weren't controllable. We don't contact Gerald or Patricia directly yet, not until we know more about how Damien is monitoring communication channels. We use the third party, Sonia, to probe, see if Patricia responds in a way that's safe. And if she doesn't, then we find another route. He stood up, took his mug to the sink. What time does Ellie get back from school? Avery checked her phone, the first time he'd seen her use it since she'd arrived. She said 3:30. She told you her schedule. She told me her schedule, her teacher's name, her best friend's name, and the complete taxonomy of the dinosaur family, with emphasis on what she considers to be the unfairly underrepresented species. Avery said it without smiling, but her voice had lost the taut, managed quality it carried when she was talking about Damien. I feel like I've been briefed. She briefs everyone, Nolan said. It's how she processes new people. He paused. She likes you. I know. Something shifted in Avery's voice just slightly. I don't know what to do with that. He looked at her. She was looking at the table. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. She's 7. She just likes who she likes. The first 3 days had a rhythm that Nolan hadn't anticipated. Not smooth, not easy, but functional in the way that things become functional when the people involved are practical enough to make them work. Mornings belonged to Ellie, the controlled chaos of breakfast, the perpetual negotiation over hair, the missing shoe that was always in the same place she'd left it and never in the place she remembered leaving it. Nolan moved through all of it with the particular efficiency of a single parent who'd had 3 years to develop systems, and Avery learned quickly where to stand and when to step in and when to stay out of the way. She made the coffee without being asked, starting the third morning. She figured out that Ellie's backpack needed to be packed the night before, or the morning became impossible. These were small things. She did them without announcing she was doing them. After Ellie was at school, the kitchen table became a working space. Avery had her laptop and her legal pads. Nolan had his service calls. There were 3 jobs each of those first days, and he did all of them because stopping his routine without explanation would attract questions he didn't need. He came back by noon, and they worked through what she'd found in the morning. She was meticulous. He'd expected that from the legal pad, but the depth of it surprised him. Not the intelligence, which was obvious, but the specificity. She'd built a timeline of every transaction, cross-referenced against email communications, against calendar entries she'd pulled from the shadow logging system, against the financial patterns that should have existed and the ones that actually did. Damien had been careful. She'd been more careful, in retrospect, than she'd known at the time. "This one," she said on the second day, pointing at a line on the screen. "This transfer. Here." He routed it through a company registered in Delaware, which is real, but the listed address is a mail drop, and the services invoiced were described as strategic advisory retainer, which is broad enough to be almost anything. But the date is 3 days after he was declined on a personal loan application. "How do you know about the loan application?" She hesitated, not defensively, but with the slight pause of someone deciding how much to explain. "I have access to his personal financial records. Not because I was snooping. He gave me power of attorney over certain accounts 2 years ago for emergency purposes, and I used it to pull his credit file when I started finding the anomalies. I wanted to understand the motive." "Did anyone else see the power of attorney?" "The company's general counsel, who is currently aligned with Damien." Whoa. Nolan made a note on his own pad. A smaller one, spiral-bound, the kind he used for service calls. "So that's a liability. If they know you have access to his personal accounts, they can characterize it as unauthorized access, yes, which is why I haven't used anything from his credit file as primary evidence. It's supporting context for me, not something I'd put in front of the board." She looked at him. "You're not bad at this." "At what?" "At seeing the legal exposure angles. Most people just think about whether the evidence is true, not how it can be weaponized against you. I've sat through enough debrief sessions where the question of what we knew was less important than how we could be claimed to have known it," he said. "It teaches you something." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." Cool. The cut on his forearm was healing without infection, which he was grateful for. Avery had redressed it on the second morning without making it a production. She'd just seen him checking it in the bathroom doorway while Ellie was eating breakfast, come over, and done it with a competence that suggested she'd had first aid training at some point and hadn't forgotten it. "You got this because of me," she said, working the tape down. "I got it because I walked into an alley." "Nolan." It's fine, occupational hazard." "You don't have an occupation that involves alleys." He looked at her. "I did for a long time." She looked back at him with the frank, assessing attention she'd had from the beginning. Then she pressed the last piece of tape down and let go of his arm. "Does it bother you? Not doing it anymore?" "The question people usually ask is whether I miss it. That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "not the violence. The clarity of it. There's a part of the job that's very uncomplicated at the moment of actually doing it. Everything narrows down to what's in front of you and what needs to happen. Everything else goes quiet." He looked at his arm. "The rest of it, I don't miss." "What rest of it?" "The cost," he said simply. "The things you bring home." She seemed to understand that he didn't mean it as a door he was opening for further inquiry. She handed him back the roll of tape and went to get her coffee. Ellie came home on Wednesday afternoon with a school project, an illustrated timeline of a person I admire that was due on Friday, and announced at approximately 3:45 that she had decided her person was Avery. Nolan was in the kitchen. Avery was in the living room with her laptop. The silence that followed this announcement lasted long enough that he came to the doorway to see what was happening. What was happening was Ellie. Standing in the center of the living room with her backpack still on, explaining her reasoning with the systematic thoroughness she applied to most things. Because she's a CEO, she said, which means she's the boss of a whole company. And also she got hurt and she didn't cry. And also she said green is her favorite color, which is my second favorite color after yellow. And my teacher said it has to be someone I actually know, so. Avery had closed the laptop. She was looking at Ellie with an expression that Nolan didn't have a name for, something between undone and steadied at the same time. "Ellie?" he started. "It's fine," Avery said. She looked at him briefly, then back at Ellie. "I'm honored, but I have to tell you something honest." "Okay," Ellie said, accepting this condition. "I'm not a CEO right now. I'm in a situation that's complicated. I made some mistakes. Not the ones people are saying I made, but others, about trusting the wrong person and not seeing something I should have seen earlier." Ellie considered this. "My teacher says you can still admire people even when they make mistakes. She says that's actually more real than admiring someone perfect." "Your teacher sounds smart." "She's okay. She gives a lot of homework." Avery looked at her for a moment longer. "Okay," she said. "You can do the project. But I want to actually help you with it. Tell me what the timeline needs to cover." Ellie dropped her backpack and climbed onto the couch, and they spent the next 40 minutes at the coffee table while Nolan made dinner, their voices mixing with the sound of the rain that had come back in the early afternoon. Ellie asking questions, and Avery answering them in a voice that Nolan noticed was slightly different from her normal voice. A little less precise, a little more willing to land somewhere uncertain. She talked about starting the company with nothing but a rented server and a contract from a small security firm that she'd pitched for 6 months before they said yes. She talked about the first time they'd missed payroll by one time early on, and how she'd taken out a personal loan and not told her co-founder because she didn't want him to panic. She talked about the things she was good at and the things she wasn't, with the same directness she brought to everything. And Ellie drew a small cartoon version of a younger Avery sitting at a laptop looking determined and slightly overwhelmed. The drawing was not accurate by any conventional artistic standard. Avery put it with the other drawing in the front pocket of her laptop bag. On Thursday evening, the careful equilibrium of the apartment shifted. Nolan came back from his last service call, a refrigerator compressor replacement in Fremont, later than he'd expected, traffic having done what Seattle traffic did in the late afternoon. Ellie was at the kitchen table doing homework, which was good. Avery was not in the living room, which was where she usually was at this hour. He found her standing at the narrow window at the end of the hallway, looking at the street below. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not the loose posture of someone watching the street idly, but the tight, contained posture of someone managing something. "What happened?" he said. She turned. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing the opposite. "I got a text from a number I don't recognize, but the content—" She stopped. The content was specific. It referenced a hotel I stayed in last week, by name, and it said, "We know you're close. Come in, and this gets easier for everyone." That's not a general threat. That's someone who's been mapping my movements. He held out his hand for her phone. She gave it to him. He looked at the message. "When did you get this?" "About 40 minutes ago. I didn't want to say anything in front of Ellie." "Good call." He looked at the number, which told him nothing useful yet. "Have you responded?" "No?" "Don't." He gave her back the phone. A threat that asks you to come in is a threat that doesn't know exactly where you are. If they knew this address, they wouldn't be sending texts. That's not entirely reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be accurate. He was thinking fast. "The hotel you stayed in. How many places knew you were there?" "No one. I paid cash, gave a false name." "Camera footage. If they have contacts in city systems or private security networks?" He shook his head. "They've been working backward from the alley. They know the general area. They don't have you." He looked at her. "But they're getting methodical." She uncrossed her arms. The movement looked like something being let go of reluctantly. "I should leave," she said. "If this location gets tied to you, you're not going anywhere in the middle of the night with 9 days left on the clock." He said it without heat, but without room for argument either. "You leave now and you're mobile and unprotected, and they're actively looking. That's the worst combination." She looked at him for a long moment. You can't be responsible for us being found. Avery, he waited until she stopped talking. I'm not asking you to stay because I don't understand the risk. I'm asking you to stay because I've run enough operations in enough bad conditions to know that moving when you're being tracked and you don't have a confirmed safe destination is how people get caught. You stay. We adjust the security here. We get you in front of that board before they find you. She was quiet. In the kitchen, Ellie said something to herself about the math problem she was working on. A disgruntled, muttered observation about fractions that neither of them was close enough to make out fully. Adjust the security how? Avery said finally. Different routine. I vary the times I leave and come back. We don't create a pattern at the windows. The front door gets a second lock. I have a portable bar that'll do it. And we move up the timeline on reaching Patricia Ewan. She looked at him steadily. The text scared me, she said. Straightforward, without apology. I want to be clear about that. I don't panic, but this scared me. I know, he said. That's the appropriate response. She exhaled. Okay, she said. I'll stay. They reached Sonia that evening. Avery typed the message, Nolan read it before she sent it, suggested 2 changes that made it less traceable in terms of the information it implied. The message went to Sonia's personal email and said almost nothing directly. I need 30 minutes with someone who still uses their original office line. Can you make a call for me? It's important and it's time sensitive and I can't explain through this channel. Sonia replied within 2 hours. Patricia Ewan would call Avery's current number on Saturday morning at 9. 2 days felt both too long and not long enough. That night, after Ellie was genuinely asleep and the apartment had settled into its quiet, Avery and Nolan sat at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner still between them and a map of the building's exterior on Nolan's phone. He talked through what he was adjusting about the physical security of the apartment, not in a way that was meant to alarm, but practically and specifically the way he did most things. She listened and asked one question about the back stairwell access, and he answered it, and she nodded. Then there was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but that had something in it. Tell me about her, Avery said. He knew who she meant. What do you want to know? Whatever you want to say. He looked at his coffee mug. She was 5 when Dana left. She cried for about 2 weeks, and then she stopped and started asking logistical questions. When will I see Mom? Where are her things? Can we get a fish? He paused. We got a fish. It died inside a month. Was she upset about the fish? Devastated. We had a funeral. She wrote a eulogy. He looked up. It was actually pretty good. She talked about how the fish, whose name was Gerald, she named a fish Gerald. She did. She talked about how Gerald had been a good listener and never interrupted and would be remembered for that. He was quiet for a moment, but not a heavy quiet. Just the ordinary weight of memory. She's resilient in a way I didn't teach her. I don't know where she got it. Maybe she didn't get it from anyone, Avery said. Maybe she just is. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, turning her coffee mug in her hands the way she did when she was thinking. What about you? He said. Family? She shook her head once. My parents divorced when I was 12. My mother remarried twice, neither time particularly successfully. My father we're not close. He was never really interested in the daughter version of me, only in what the daughter could become. And when I became it, it turned out he wasn't that interested in that either. She said it without particular bitterness, which somehow made it land harder than bitterness would have. I've been mostly on my own since I was about 22. And Damien. She was quiet for a moment. Damien was, for a long time, he was the closest thing I had. Not romantically, we were never that, but she stopped. Tried again. You build something with someone over 6 years. You trust them with the ugly parts of how decisions get made, with the times things nearly fell apart. It's a kind of intimacy. I don't have a better word for it. And then you found out. And then I found out. She looked up. The thing that makes me angry, the thing I can't stop coming back to, isn't the money. It's that he knew exactly what I'd built and what it cost, and he did it anyway. He looked at something I'd given everything to, and he decided it was worth less than whatever he needed the money for. Her voice had gone very flat and very precise. That's the part I don't know how to... She stopped, set the mug down. I'm fine, she said, which was clearly not entirely true, but also clearly the boundary of how far she was going to go tonight, and he respected that without comment. Get some sleep, he said. Saturday matters. She got up, collected the mugs, stood at the sink. Nolan, for what it's worth, Mom, and I know it's not a simple thing to say, I think what you built here is better than anything I built. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the true thing. It's got a lot of cracks in it. Most things worth having do, she said. She turned off the kitchen light. He sat for another few minutes in the dark before he went to bed. Friday was Ellie's project presentation day. She presented her Avery timeline to her class and came home with a grade of A-, which her teacher had noted was minus only because the illustrated CEO cartoon had been given what the teacher described as perhaps an ambitious number of lightning bolts, suggesting power, which Ellie felt was not a valid critique. Avery read the graded project with the careful attention she gave to financial documents. The lightning bolts were interpretive, she said. That's what I said, Ellie agreed. You got an A- on a project about me, Avery said. I want to be annoyed about the minus, but I'm genuinely touched by the rest of it. I can add more lightning bolts for the real version, Ellie offered. I think that's the right call. Nolan watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say, and because the feeling it produced in him was one he hadn't had in a while. Not happiness, exactly, which was a word that always felt slightly inaccurate to him, but something more like rightness, like a structure that had been functional was now also, somehow, inhabited properly. He was aware that this was a problem. He was aware that it was a problem he'd examine more carefully when there were fewer immediate threats. For now, he put dinner on. The rain came and went. Ellie complained about fractions, and Avery helped her with them in a way that was surprisingly patient, reframing the concept 3 different times until Ellie's face went from resistant to reluctant understanding. Saturday was 9 hours away. 9 hours, and then a phone call that might be the first real crack in 10 days of closed doors. Nolan went to check the window latches one more time before turning in, not because he thought anything would happen tonight, but because checking was what you did when something mattered, when the people under your care were sleeping and the city outside was making its ordinary sounds and you were the one standing between ordinary and whatever came next. He checked all 3 windows. He tightened the door bar. He listened to the building for a full minute. Everything was quiet. He went to bed and did not sleep well, which was fine. He hadn't slept well in years, and he'd learned a long time ago to function in the space that remained. Patricia Ewan called at 9:04 on Saturday morning. Avery had been sitting at the kitchen table since 8:15 with her coffee going cold beside her, and the legal pad open to a page she'd written and rewritten 3 times, not because she didn't know what to say, but because the window for saying it correctly was narrow enough that she'd wanted every word to be exactly the one she meant. Nolan had taken Ellie to the library, a Saturday routine he'd maintained deliberately, keeping Ellie's world as unchanged as possible. And the apartment was quiet in the particular way apartments are quiet when you're waiting for something. When the phone rang, Avery picked up on the second ring. Patricia, she said. Avery? Patricia Ewan's voice was careful, not cold, but measured in the way of someone who had learned to be measured before speaking in situations that could be recorded or misrepresented. Sonia told me you needed to talk. I want to hear what you have to say. I also want to tell you up front that I'm not in a position to make commitments on this call. I know, Avery said. I'm not asking for commitments. I'm asking for 20 minutes and an open mind. A pause. Go ahead. She talked for 18 minutes. She'd practiced it enough that it didn't sound practiced. She'd stripped it down to the essential architecture, the way you present to a board when you have limited time and need every minute to matter. She walked Patricia through the transaction timeline, through the forged documentation she'd identified, through the shadow logging records and what they showed about Damien's communications in the period leading up to and following each major transfer. She explained the Delaware Shell Company, the personal loan application, the pattern of timing that connected his financial need to the first anomalous transfer with a precision that wasn't coincidental. She told her about the lawyers arriving within 48 hours. She told her about losing access to her own systems. She told her about 10 days moving through Seattle, trying not to stay anywhere long enough to be found. She did not tell her about the alley, or about Nolan, or about Ellie. Those were not Patricia's business and were not what the call was about. When she finished, the silence on the other end lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. "How much of this is on the laptop?" Patricia said finally. "All of it. Everything I've described exists in documentary form. The transaction records are original data pulls, not screenshots. I can show the metadata. The logging records are time-stamped and server verified. If you put a forensic accountant on the transaction data for 8 hours, they'll find the same thing I found. Damien has presented a very different picture to the board. I know what picture he's presented. I know it in detail because I built the communications platform he used to present it, and I have access to the internal discussions around it." Another pause. "You have access to internal board communications?" The shadow logging system covered executive communications. The board communications that went through company channels? Yes. The silence this time had a different quality. Avery recognized it. It was the silence of someone recalculating. "Avery," Patricia said, "I need to be direct with you. Please. What you're describing, if it's accurate, and I'm not in a position to verify that on a Saturday morning phone call, is a significant problem, not just for Damien, for the board, for every decision we've made in the past 18 months on the basis of financial information that may have been distorted." Her voice was still measured, but there was something harder under it now, the specific hardness of someone who does not like being made a fool of. "If you're telling the truth and we ratify those structural changes on Thursday without hearing your case, and this comes out afterward, and it will come out, these things always come out, then we are exposed in a way that is not recoverable." "I know," Avery said. "That's why I'm asking for access to the meeting. Damien will contest it. He'll try to have you removed before you can present. I know that too. So I need to know something." Patricia's voice dropped half a register, becoming something more direct and less board meeting. "Are you walking in there alone?" Avery looked at the kitchen table, at the legal pad, at the 2 drawings in the front pocket of her laptop bag that she could see from where she was sitting. "No," she said. "I'm not." Nolan and Ellie came back from the library at 10:45. Ellie was carrying 4 books, which was the maximum she was allowed to check out at one time, and she had already begun describing the plot of the top one. Something about a girl who discovered her grandmother had been secretly mapping an underground city before she was fully through the door. Nolan came in behind her, read Avery's face in approximately 1 second, and said, "Ellie, go put your books in your room." "I'm telling Avery about—" "I know. Books first. 2 minutes." Ellie went, with the expression of someone who understood the priority structure, even if she didn't appreciate it. Nolan closed the door. "How did it go?" "She'll come," Avery said. "Not as an ally, not officially. She was careful about that. But she'll ensure I have access to the floor when the meeting convenes. She can't keep Damien from objecting, but she can make sure I'm not stopped at the door." He nodded slowly. "And Damien? Will he know you reached out to her?" "Possibly, eventually, but not before Thursday, I think. Patricia was careful about how she said things, which means she's been careful about other things too. She's been watching." Avery exhaled. "She said something at the end of the call. She said he's been too confident, and that's always a bad sign. I think she's been suspicious for a while. She just needed someone to hand her a reason to act on it." "So Thursday," Nolan said. 5 days?" 5 days. He took off his jacket. "Then we spend the next 5 days making sure what you bring to that room is airtight. Not just evidentially, presentation. How you stand, what you lead with, what you hold back until they push. Damien is going to try to destabilize you the moment you walk in. If he can get you emotional or defensive before you've made your core case, that's how he wins." Avery looked at him. "You sound like you've prepared testimony before." "Well, I've prepared debrief presentations in front of people who did not want to hear what I was going to say," he said. "It's not different in the ways that matter." Ellie reappeared in the kitchen doorway. "Can I tell Avery about the book now?" "Yes," they said at the same time, and Ellie came in and climbed onto the chair beside Avery and opened to the first chapter and began. The 5 days before Thursday were the most structured thing Nolan had organized since the Navy, and he was aware of the strange doubling of it, The same concentration, the same breaking down of a problem into manageable elements, the same attention to what could be controlled and deliberate release of what couldn't. Except the objective wasn't a position or a target. The objective was a woman walking into a room and not being destroyed. They worked mornings after Ellie went to school. Avery had organized the evidence into a presentation structure that was tight and logical, and Nolan's job, which he'd assigned himself without discussion, was to attack it. He played the board members who wouldn't want to believe her. He played Damien's objections. He asked the questions that were designed not to find truth but to create doubt. And he watched how she handled them. And when she handled them badly, when she got precise in a way that read as cold, or certain in a way that read as defensive, he said so. "You did it again," he said on Monday afternoon. "Did what?" "When I challenged the timeline on the third transfer, you gave me the exact timestamp down to the minute. That's not a response. That's a wall. The board doesn't need the minute. The minute makes you look like you rehearsed it." She looked at him. "I did rehearse it." "I know. Don't let it show." She leaned back, pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. "Nolan, I know what I'm talking about. The data is exact because the data is exact." "I believe you. The question is whether Gerald Foss believes you, and Gerald Foss has been on 3 boards in 30 years and has seen enough people lie with exact data to be suspicious of people who know too much too precisely." He pushed back from the table. "Tell me the third transfer story the way you'd tell it to someone who's never looked at a spreadsheet. No timestamps. Just what happened." She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between irritated and considering. Then she put down the pen. "Damien needed money," she said. "He'd been declined on a loan and he owed someone some. I don't know who. I only have the inference from the timing. So he created a consulting company that didn't exist, invoiced his own employer for services that were never performed, and approved the payment himself using an authorization level I'd given him 3 years earlier because I trusted him." She paused. "I gave him that authorization because we were building something together, and I didn't think I needed to check his work. That's the mistake I made. That's on me." The room was quiet. "That," Nolan said. "Lead with that." She looked at him. "With the mistake I made?" "With the fact that you trusted him and he used it. That's not weakness. That's the human context that makes the technical evidence mean something." He leaned forward. "Right now your case is airtight evidentially, and it feels like a prosecution. You need it to feel like a betrayal, because that's what it was." Avery looked at the table. Something moved in her face. Not breaking, she was too controlled for that, but shifting, like something being carefully repositioned rather than released. "I hate that you're right," she said quietly. "Most useful feedback is annoying," he said. "That's how you know it's useful." Tuesday brought a problem. He was coming back from a job in Capitol Hill. Straightforward range repair. 40 minutes. When he noticed the car parked across from his building. Dark blue, sedan, engine off, but the driver visible through the windshield, positioned at the angle that gave him a clean sight line to the building's main entrance. Nolan didn't slow down. He drove past, circled the block, came around on the parallel street and parked the van 2 buildings over. He sat for a moment. The car had plates he couldn't read from the angle he had. The driver was a man, broad-shouldered, looking at his phone in the way people looked at their phones when they were also looking at something else. Nolan had sat in enough vehicles doing exactly that thing to know what it looked like. He called the apartment from the van. Avery picked up on the first ring. "There's someone outside," he said. "Blue sedan directly across from the main entrance. Don't go near the windows on the front of the building." A silence. "How long have they been there?" "Don't know. I just got back. Are you and Ellie okay?" "Ellie's not here. She's at school." He checked the time. 2:20. Ellie got out at 3:15. "I'm coming up through the back. Stay away from the front rooms until I'm inside." He came up through the back stairwell, the one he'd checked the security on after Avery's text, the one that opened onto the alley behind the building rather than the street. He let himself in through the building's rear service door with the key he'd gotten from the super 3 years ago for exactly no reason other than that having multiple ways in and out of a building was a habit that had outlasted the context in which he'd formed it. Avery was in the kitchen when he came in. She was standing rather than sitting, which meant she'd been trying not to pace. "Has anyone buzzed the door?" he said. "No." He went to the hallway, the part of it that let him approach the front room at an angle that kept him away from the windows. He looked down at the street from the edge of the window. The car was still there. As he watched, the driver's head moved, phone down, eyes up, the building's entrance, a slow scan of the surrounding street. Then back to the phone. Not a police stakeout. Too casual for that, and they'd have parked differently. Private contractor, consistent with what Avery had described. Someone watching for pattern, for routine, for a confirmation rather than a confirmed address. "They don't know the apartment number," he said, coming back to the kitchen. "If they knew, they'd be doing this differently. They've tied the neighborhood to the alley, maybe pulled security camera footage from somewhere nearby, maybe traced the text response back to a cell tower. They're narrowing down." Avery was very still. "Ellie gets out at 3:15. "I know." "Nolan, if they see you picking her up, they'll see a man picking up his kid from a school bus stop," he said. "That's what they'll see. I'll vary the approach route. I'll come from the direction that doesn't pass the front of the building." He looked at her. You stay inside. You don't open the door for anything until I'm back with her." "And after? If they're still there tonight?" He thought about it. "Then tomorrow morning we talk about whether we move you somewhere else for the last 2 days. But I want to watch the car. If it's gone by tonight, they were doing a sweep pass, not a fixed surveillance. If it's still there tomorrow, we adjust." She nodded. She was holding herself carefully, the posture of someone managing adrenaline. "I don't want Ellie to know something's wrong." "She won't," he said. He picked up Ellie at 3:18. She came off the school bus at the corner talking to a friend about something involving a disagreement over which dinosaur was most unfairly misrepresented in popular media. Ellie's position was the Parasaurolophus. Her friend's was the Pachycephalosaurus. And she transferred seamlessly from the argument to telling Nolan about it as they walked. He listened. He kept his pace normal and his face easy. They came back to the building through the side street. The blue car was gone. He checked 3 times over the course of the evening, and it didn't come back, which was information, though not the kind that meant you relaxed. It meant they'd done a pass and moved on, which meant they hadn't confirmed this location yet, which bought time that was already running thin. Wednesday evening, Nolan did something he almost didn't do. Ellie was in bed. Avery was on the couch, the laptop open, running through the presentation one more time in the quiet, not out loud, just reading through it with the focused expression she had when she was looking for errors she might have missed. The apartment was doing its evening sounds, pipes, neighbor, distant traffic, and Nolan was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he became aware that the thing he was about to say was something he'd been not saying for most of the week, and that the reason he'd been not saying it was that it sat at the edge of a territory he'd kept fenced off for a while, and opening the gate had implications he hadn't fully worked out. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up from the laptop. "After Thursday," he said, "if it goes the way it should go, what does that look like for you?" She was quiet for a moment. "The board reinstates my position. Damien faces criminal charges. The fraud case is clear enough that I don't think his lawyers can bury it. The company goes through a period of significant instability while it restructures." She paused. "I go back. To all of it. It's what I built." He nodded. He looked at his coffee mug. "Okay?" Something in the way he said it made her close the laptop. She turned on the couch to face him more directly. "What?" "Nothing. I asked, you answered." "Nolan." He looked up. She was watching him with the same focused attention she'd given the financial records, which was thorough enough to be uncomfortable. "The company is what you built," he said. "But it's not the same thing as what you are. Those are 2 things that got attached to each other a long time ago, and I'm not sure you've looked at them separately in a while." She held his gaze. "That's a large thing to say to someone 2 days before the most important meeting of their professional life." "I know, you don't have to engage with it." "I'm engaging with it," she said. "I just don't know what to do with it yet." She looked at the closed laptop. "What I've built is the only context in which I've ever been certain of what I was doing. Does that make sense?" "Yes." So going back isn't about ego, or not entirely. She glanced toward the hallway, toward Ellie's closed door. It's about there's something that happens when you're in a context that fits, where the thing you're good at is the thing that matters. I've had that exactly once, and it was the company. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think that's still the company? She looked at him for a long time. I don't know, she said finally. It came out without the careful management she usually applied to uncertain things, which meant it was the true answer and not the processed one. Okay, he said, again, but differently this time. She opened the laptop again. He finished his coffee. They stayed in the same room without speaking for another hour, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that accumulated between people who had run out of the things you say to each other and moved into the territory of just being in the same place, which is a different and sometimes more honest thing. That's Thursday morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost insulting after a week of rain. Cold, dry air, pale winter sun cutting through the apartment windows at an angle that made everything look sharper than it had any right to. Nolan was up at 5:30. Avery was already in the kitchen. She was dressed in the clothes she'd bought 2 days ago from a second-hand shop 4 blocks away. Nolan had gone, not her, with her measurements and a description of what she needed. Something that read as CEO without reading as someone trying to look like a CEO, which was a distinction she'd explained to him with enough specificity that he'd found it in 20 minutes. Dark blazer, clean lines, nothing decorative. She'd done something to her hair that made it look the way it probably usually looked in a context that wasn't 10 days of running. The bandage on her temple was gone. The cut had healed enough to need only a thin strip that was invisible from any useful distance. She looked like herself, he thought, and then corrected it. She looked like the version of herself that existed before all of this, except that all of this had happened, which meant she wasn't quite that person anymore. How are you feeling? He said. Sick to my stomach, she said, in a productive way. Good. He poured 2 coffees. That means you're taking it seriously without being paralyzed by it. Do you get nervous before things? Every time, he said. Anyone who doesn't is either lying or has stopped caring which way it goes. She wrapped both hands around the mug. And what do you do with it? I make sure I've done everything I can do to prepare, and then I stop trying to control what I can't control, and I go in. He looked at her. You've done everything. The preparation is complete. What happens in that room is just the work paying out. She nodded slowly. Then, I want you in the room. He'd expected this might come. Patricia said she could get you access. She didn't say anything about a guest. I know, but I want you there. She said it without apology and without explanation, which was how she said the things that were true before they were tactical. Not to intervene. Just, I want you in the room. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. I'll be there. Ellie came out at 7, registered that something was different about the morning in the way she registered most things, immediately and without announcement, and looked at Avery's blazer and Nolan's cleaner-than-usual jacket and said, Is today the important day? Yes, Avery said. Ellie sat down at the table and ate her cereal with a focus that suggested she was processing this. Then she looked at Avery. Are you scared? A little, Avery said. When I had to do my project presentation, I was scared too, Ellie said. I threw up a little in the bathroom first, but then it was fine. Ellie, Nolan started, I'm just saying it was fine after. Avery looked at this child in her dinosaur pajamas eating cereal at 7 in the morning, and her face did the thing Nolan had started noticing, the thing where the careful management dropped for a moment and something undefended came through instead. She reached over and squeezed Ellie's hand once, just briefly, and let go. I'll remember that, she said. The Monroe Holt Technologies offices occupied the top 3 floors of a glass-faced building in South Lake Union, and at 9:40 on a Thursday morning, the lobby was doing the business of a company that was not currently in crisis in any way that was publicly visible. Nolan had been in buildings like this before. Not this exact kind, but the kind where everything happening on the outside was the inverse of what was happening inside, where the polished surfaces and the purposeful movement of people in expensive clothes were the performance of stability rather than its reality. They came through the front entrance together. Avery had her laptop bag. Nolan had nothing except the jacket and the specific quality of attention he carried in environments where things were about to happen. Patricia Yuen was waiting near the elevator bank. She was in her late 40s, trim, with the kind of face that had learned to reveal nothing until it chose to. She looked at Avery with an expression that was as close to relief as someone like her probably permitted in a lobby. "You look better than I expected," she said. "Thank you for making this possible," Avery said. Patricia looked at Nolan, a brief, assessing look. Avery didn't explain him, and Patricia didn't ask. "The meeting starts at 10. Damien is already upstairs. He doesn't know you're here. I kept this off all communications channels. When you walk in, he will object. The chair, Martin Greaves, will attempt to suspend the meeting protocol. I will call for a vote on whether you're allowed to present, which I am within my rights to do under the company bylaws, and Gerald will second it." She paused. "It's going to be unpleasant for about 10 minutes. "I've had unpleasant 10 minutes before," Avery said. "I know." Patricia pressed the elevator button. "One more thing. When you walk in, don't apologize for being there. Not with your words, not with your posture. You're not asking for permission. You're correcting a mistake." "I know," Avery said. The elevator opened. They got in. The ride-up was silent. Nolan watched the floor numbers change. Avery stood beside him with the laptop bag held in both hands, and he could feel the tension coming off her. Not visibly, she was too disciplined for visible, but in the way you feel it in a confined space from someone who is channeling everything into stillness. At the 14th floor, the doors opened. The boardroom was glass-walled, visible from the corridor. A long table, 8 people already seated, and at the far end, Damien Holt. He was 51 years old, well-constructed in the way of men who'd spent 20 years being photographed for business publications, silver at the temples, the kind of groomed that looked effortless because it was expensive, a face that had learned the trick of looking open and reasonable in almost any circumstance. He saw Avery through the glass. His face went through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds: surprise, recalculation, and then something smooth and controlled that settled over the others like a drop cloth. He said something to the man beside him that Nolan couldn't hear through the glass. "Ready?" Patricia said to Avery. Avery looked at the boardroom. She looked at Damien, who was now composing something that would be designed to look like legitimate concern. She looked at the table full of people who had, for the past 3 weeks, been receiving a very specific narrative about her. "Yes," she said. She pushed the door open. The room turned. "Good morning," Avery said, and her voice carried exactly the right amount. Not loud, not aggressive, not performatively calm. Just the register of someone who belonged in the room and knew it. "I apologize for the unconventional entry. I won't be long." Damien was already on his feet. "This meeting is closed. Avery, you don't have authorization to—" "Patricia," Avery said without looking at Damien. Patricia stepped forward. "I'm calling for a procedural vote on whether Ms. Monroe is permitted to address the board. Under Section 9 of our bylaws, any board member may call for such a vote." Gerald Foss, 63, careful and conservative as advertised, looked at Damien with an expression that had the quality of someone who'd been waiting to use it. "Seconded," he said. Damien's composure held, but only just. "This is irregular and—" "The vote is called," Patricia said. "All in favor of allowing Miss Monroe to present?" 5 hands, out of 8. Damien's jaw moved once. Avery set her laptop on the table and connected it to the room's display without hurrying, without glancing at Damien, without any of the apologetic speed that would have read his uncertainty. Nolan stood near the door, which was where he should stand, present but not central, there as ballast rather than intervention. She opened the first document. "In the 18 months between January of last year and last month," she said, $11.4 million was moved out of Monroe Holt Technologies through a series of transactions structured to appear as legitimate consulting fees. I'm going to show you each one. I'm going to show you the company that received the funds, and I'm going to show you why that company doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. And then I'm going to show you the communications that tell you who authorized each transaction and why." She looked up from the screen. The room was very quiet. "I built this company," she said. "I trusted my co-founder with parts of it that I should have verified more carefully. That's the mistake I made, and I'm not here to pretend otherwise. She let that land. But what happened to this company is not my mistake, and I have everything you need to understand exactly what it is. She advanced to the second slide. Damien said, "These documents are fabricated. They're original server logs with cryptographic verification hashes," Avery said without raising her voice. "Your forensic team can verify them in an hour. I'd suggest you let me finish first." She kept going. The room changed by degrees, the kind of change that happens when a group of people is being moved not by emotion, but by the accumulation of specific, verifiable, mutually corroborating evidence. Gerald Foss had his reading glasses on by the third slide. Two of the other board members had moved forward in their chairs. Patricia was watching Damien with the expression she'd been constructing all morning. Damien tried 3 more times to interrupt. The first 2 people in the room talked over him without discussion. Not dramatically, just the way a room that is paying attention to something important deals with noise. The third time, Martin Greaves, the board chair who had begun the morning aligned with Damien and was now visibly recalculating, put up one hand. "Damien, let her finish." Nolan watched Damien's face absorb this. The composure held in form but not in content. Something behind the eyes was moving fast, working contingencies, the way a man worked contingencies when he was realizing that the room had turned and the only question left was how far it turned and what it cost. Avery reached the communication logs. "This message," she said, "was sent from Damien Holt's company account to the registered agent of Vantara Strategic Partners, the Delaware consulting company, 4 days before the first transfer was authorized. The message references a prior arrangement and requests acceleration of the initial disbursement. The company receiving that disbursement had been registered 11 days earlier. There was no prior arrangement of any legitimate kind. The arrangement being referenced is the one I've just shown you." She advanced again. "This message was sent the day after I confronted Damien about the financial irregularities. It's addressed to the company's general counsel, and it contains specific instructions about how to build a preemptive legal case claiming that I was responsible for the fraud. The instructions are detailed. They were prepared in advance." She paused. "He knew I'd find it. He had a plan for when I did." The room was past quiet now. It was the specific silence of people who have received information that reorganizes what they know and are sitting inside the reorganization. Damien said, "You had no right to access those communications. The logging system was disclosed in the company's security architecture documentation filed with the board in year 4, Avery said. "You signed the acknowledgement page." She reached into the laptop bag and produced a single printed sheet. "Page 7, third paragraph. Your signature is at the bottom." She set it on the table. Gerald Foss picked it up. After that, Damien didn't say anything else. The meeting ran another 50 minutes. Avery answered questions. Real ones, hard ones, the kind that came from people who were now genuinely trying to understand what had happened rather than managing a narrative. She answered them directly, without the wall of precision Nolan had corrected her out of, the way a person answers things when they know what they know and have nothing to hide about how they know it. Security was called at 11:40. Nolan watched 2 men he didn't recognize guide Damien Holt out of the boardroom with a thoroughness that was not rough, but was not uncertain either. Damien walked with the posture of someone who had not yet found the version of this that he could live with. And that was not Nolan's problem. By 12:15, the board had voted on 3 things. The vote on each was 6-1, with 1 abstention. Avery walked out of the boardroom at 12:22 and stood in the corridor and breathed. 1 breath, 2. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, the way you do when something very large has been held in a compressed space for a long time and is now decompressing. Nolan stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't need anything said. After a moment, she looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't someone who cried in corridors outside boardrooms, and she likely never would be, and whatever she was feeling was entirely her own, and she was entitled to it. "It held," she said, "just that." "Yes," he said. She looked back at the glass wall of the empty boardroom. At the presentation still on the screen, the company's internal financial records displayed in the clear light of a winter morning, evidence of the thing she'd built, and the thing that had been done to it, and the distance she'd traveled to stand in front of the right people and say, "This is what happened," and be believed. "Let's go home," she said. The word came out before she'd chosen it, and she heard it when it landed, and she looked at him with the quick, undefended expression of someone who has said the true thing by accident. He didn't make it into anything larger than what it was. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." They walked to the elevator. Outside, through the building's tall glass front, the winter sun was doing what it did when it occasionally appeared in November Seattle, burning brief and pale, and not quite warm enough, but present. The elevator ride down was 17 floors, and neither of them spoke through any of it. Not because there was nothing to say, there was probably too much stacked in the particular way that things stack when you've been moving toward a fixed point for so long that arriving at it leaves you with no immediate next direction. Avery stood with the laptop bag against her side and her eyes forward, and Nolan stood beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets. And when the doors opened on the lobby, the cold air of the building's ground floor came in, and she exhaled in a way that was almost involuntary, like the body releasing something the mind hadn't yet given permission to release. They walked out into the November light. "Are you hungry?" he said. She turned and looked at him, and what was on her face was not what he'd expected. Not relief, not triumph, not the specific brightness of someone who has won something. It was something more complicated and more tired, the expression of someone who has spent 11 days running toward a single objective and has reached it and is now standing on the other side of it without the forward motion that had been holding everything together. "I don't know," she said. Honest. "Okay," he said. "We'll figure it out." They walked. Not toward anything specific, not immediately, just along the waterfront where the sound of the water came up from below the seawall, and the tourist boats sat quiet in the cold, and the city moved around them in the ordinary, purposeful way of cities that don't know what just happened a dozen blocks inland in a glass-walled boardroom. Avery said, after a while, "Patricia offered me the CEO position back before I left." "In the meeting?" "After. She caught me in the corridor before you came out." She paused. "She said the board wanted to move quickly on restoring confidence, that my name back in the position would be the clearest signal to the market that the fraud was isolated and contained." He didn't ask what she'd said. He waited. "I told her I needed time to think," she said, "which I've never said in my professional life in response to an offer I wanted." "Do you want it?" She was quiet long enough that it wasn't a question she was dodging. It was a question she was genuinely working inside of. 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes without the pause," she said. "Not because I was thoughtless, because there wasn't any version of what I wanted that existed outside of that company. And now..." She stopped walking. They were at the railing above the water. She looked out. "And now I'm standing here and I'm trying to find the version of me that wants to go back, and she's there, but she's smaller than she used to be. She takes up less of the space." He stood beside her at the railing. "What's taking up the rest?" She didn't answer that directly. She looked at the water for another moment, and then she said, "What time does Ellie get out today?" 2:45, early release Thursday. "We should go." They went. Ellie saw their faces when they came to the bus stop, both of them together, which was unusual, and she ran the last 20 feet from the bus door with her backpack bouncing and hit Avery first, which surprised all three of them, including Ellie, who stopped afterward and looked slightly uncertain about what she'd done. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," Avery said. She crouched down to Ellie's level. "It went okay." "Did you win?" "It's not," Avery started, and then stopped, and reconsidered the correction she'd been about to make. "Yes," she said. "It went the right way." Ellie nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd expected this outcome and was glad to have it confirmed. "I told my friend Maisie that you were going to fix it," she said. "She didn't believe me, but I told her." "What did you tell her about it?" "I said you had the evidence, and the evidence was right, and the people were going to have to listen." She said it with the uncomplicated confidence of a 7-year-old who had evaluated a situation and reached a conclusion and hadn't spent any energy doubting the conclusion. "Was I right?" "You were right," Avery said. Ellie accepted this and transferred her attention to whether there was any possibility of getting spring rolls from the Vietnamese place on the way home, which there was. The days that followed had a different quality from the days before. Slower, less pressurized, but not easier in the way that Nolan might have anticipated. Relief turned out to be its own kind of complicated. Avery stayed in the apartment, not because she had nowhere else to go. The board, as one of its first corrective actions, had arranged for her access to be restored to her company accounts and her company-paid housing, a two-bedroom apartment in First Hill that she'd barely lived in before everything fell apart. She could have moved back there. She didn't. She didn't discuss this directly. She just stayed, the way she'd done since the first night, making coffee in the morning, helping with Ellie's homework in the evenings, occupying her half of the kitchen table's working space with the new set of tasks that had replaced the old ones, calls with the company's legal team, with the forensic accountants, with Patricia and Gerald and several people whose names Nolan heard only in fragments through a closed kitchen door. The criminal case against Damien was moving through its early stages with the thoroughness that financial fraud cases moved when the evidence was organized by the person who'd built the system being defrauded and therefore knew exactly where everything was. She was good on the phone. He could hear it even through the door, the same precision, but now without the defensive edge of someone managing a threat. She sounded like someone handling complicated logistics, which was apparently something she was very capable of. But in the evenings, when the calls were done, and Ellie was at the table with her homework and dinner was happening, Avery moved differently, slower. She laughed at things Ellie said with a looseness that hadn't been there before. She asked Nolan about his service calls in the way someone asks who is actually curious rather than filling silence, and he found himself telling her more than he usually would, about the particular texture of different people's houses, about the retired engineer in Magnolia who had an opinion about every repair technique and was usually right, about the family in Rainier Beach whose dishwasher he'd fixed 4 times in 8 months, and who he suspected were doing something structurally inadvisable with it, but who were too polite to tell him what. She listened. She had the particular quality of listening that meant she was actually in the conversation rather than waiting for her turn to speak, which was rarer than it should be. One evening, Ellie fell asleep on the couch while they were watching a nature documentary. She'd made it through the segment on deep-sea creatures and lost the battle somewhere in the early portion of the segment on migratory birds. And Nolan carried her to her room and came back, and Avery had turned the volume down and was sitting with her legs tucked under her and a mug of tea, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had arrived somewhere and was quietly noticing what it felt like to not be moving. "I called Patricia today," she said. "About the position?" "About the position." She turned the mug in her hands. "I told her I needed another week." He sat down. "What happens in a week?" "I don't know," she said. "That's why I need it." He didn't push on it. He'd learned the shapes of what she needed space around, and this was one of them. Not avoidance, but actual processing time, the genuine kind. She'd been making decisions at speed for 11 days, and she needed something else now. He understood that more than he had language for, because he'd had his own version of it when he came out of the Navy. That particular disorientation of forward motion stopping and having to learn to stand still without falling. "Can I tell you what I see?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes." "When you talk about the company, you talk about what it was and what you built and what it cost to build it. You don't... I haven't heard you talk about what it feels like to be running it, the day-to-day of it." She was quiet. "That might not mean anything," he said. "Some people just don't talk that way. But it might mean the thing you loved wasn't the being CEO part. It was the building part. And if the building is done, it's not done," she said. "Companies are never..." "Avery." She stopped. "You know what I mean," he said. She looked at the mug. A long moment passed. "The building part is the only part that ever felt like it was actually mine," she said quietly. "Once it was built and I was running it, there were days when it felt like the company ran me more than I ran it. The meetings and the optics and the investor relationships and the..." She stopped. "I was good at it. I am good at it. But good at something and needing something are different things. What do you need?" She looked up at him. The question sat between them. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think that's the first honest answer I've given to that question in about 6 years. Chab. 10 days after the board meeting, something shifted. It happened in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, ordinary as anything. Ellie was making pancakes, a project she had taken on with the full weight of her attention, and a library book about breakfast foods that she'd checked out for reasons no one had questioned. And Avery was at the counter doing the part of the project that involved not letting Ellie burn anything. and Nolan was at the table with coffee and his phone, reading a service request that had come in for Monday. He heard Ellie say, "Avery, do you like it here?" He looked up. Avery was at the stove with the spatula. She didn't answer immediately, in a way that meant she was taking the question seriously rather than deflecting it. "Yes," she said. "More than your apartment?" "I haven't been to my apartment in a while." "But if you went back," Ellie said, with the persistence of a 7-year-old who has identified a logical gap and intends to close it, "would you like it more or less?" Avery looked at the pancake she was flipping. "Less," she said. Ellie seemed satisfied with this. She moved on to the question of whether blueberries should go in before or after the flip, which was apparently a serious debate in the breakfast food community, according to the library book. Nolan looked back at his phone. He wasn't reading it. After breakfast, after Ellie had consumed 2 pancakes and declared the experiment a success and gone to find the second book in the Underground City series, Avery washed the pan and Nolan dried it, and she said, without looking at him, "I called Patricia this morning." "What did you decide?" She handed him the pan. "I'm not taking the CEO position back." He set the pan on the counter. "Okay, but I'm going to consult on the transition. Make sure they don't install someone who undoes everything that was built well about the company. And I've already started talking to a woman named Frances Cho who runs a nonprofit incubator, organizations that help small businesses in underserved communities access capital and legal infrastructure. She needs someone who understands how companies are actually built, not just theoretically." She paused. "The consulting pays about 20% of what I was making. I want to be clear-eyed about that trade." "Are you clear-eyed about it?" "More than I've been about anything in a while." He looked at her. She was looking at the pan on the counter, and then she looked at him, and her face was not relieved or light in the way of someone who has made an easy decision. It had the more complicated quality of someone who has made the true decision rather than the comfortable one and is in the early stage of understanding what that means. "Nolan," she said. "Yeah. I know that I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been staying here past the point where I had a reason that was about safety. I should say that directly." "I know," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what the honest version of this is, for all 3 of us." She glanced toward the hallway. "She's 7. She attaches to people without knowing how to protect herself from it. And if she's been through harder things than she shows," he said, and it came out a little rougher than he'd intended. "She knows what impermanence feels like. She's not fragile." "I'm not saying she's fragile. I'm saying it matters what we do." She met his eyes. "It matters what you do. You're her parent. I don't want to be something that happens to your family without you choosing it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Ellie's voice floated from her room. She was talking to herself about the book, narrating something in a whisper the way she did when she was excited. "What are you asking?" he said. "I'm not asking anything," she said. "I'm telling you that I want to stay, and I'm asking whether that's something you're choosing." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, which she almost always did, which was one of the things about her that had been consistent from the alley to the boardroom to this Sunday kitchen. She looked at things directly, even when the direct look was hard. "Yes," he said. Just the one word. Not elaborated, not softened, not surrounded by qualifications. She'd asked a direct question, and that was the direct answer. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatic, just the specific small shift of someone who has said the uncertain thing out loud and had it met rather than managed. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. From the hallway, "Dad, can I have a snack? You had 2 pancakes 20 minutes ago." "That was breakfast. A snack is different." Avery pressed her lips together, which was the thing she did before she laughed, which was a recent development. The laughter had been rare early on and had become less so. "She has a point," she said. "She always has a point," Nolan said. "It's a problem." He went to get Ellie a snack. The kitchen settled back into its Sunday sounds. Outside, the November rain had returned and was doing its thing against the windows, low and persistent. The ordinary sound of Seattle choosing weather over clarity. The weeks that followed did not arrange themselves into anything simple. Avery moved some things from her First Hill apartment to the apartment on Pike. Not all of it, not in a way that announced itself as a permanent change, just the things she reached for regularly and kept finding absent. A good coffee grinder. 3 books she was in the middle of. A blanket that was better than the one she'd been using. Nolan made room in the closet without being asked, which she noticed and didn't comment on. She started at the Francis Cho nonprofit the first week of December. She took the bus, which she had not done in years, and she sat in the meetings with small business owners. A woman who ran a catering company and needed to understand her own accounting. A man trying to formalize a construction business that had been operating informally for a decade. A young couple whose childcare service was expanding faster than their structure could hold. And she brought to each of them the thing she actually knew, which was not theory, but the specific texture of how businesses failed and why, and what you did about it before and after. She came home from the second week with mud on her shoes from a site visit and told Nolan about the construction business owner, a man named Terrence, 53, who had been doing everything right and had never had anyone explain to him why his invoicing model was costing him 3 months of cash flow. And she talked about it with the same energy she'd had when she was pulling apart Damien's transaction records, except different in quality, lighter, the energy of someone who has figured out something useful and gotten to use it for the right purpose. "You like it," Nolan said. "Yes," she said simply. Ellie looked up from her homework. "What's invoicing?" "It's how you ask people to pay you for work," Avery said. "Like when Dad sends the bill for fixing the dishwasher?" "Exactly like that." Ellie nodded and went back to her homework, apparently satisfied that the concept had been adequately connected to something real. Nolan's own life during this time did not change dramatically, which was the point and also occasionally the difficulty. He still drove the white van. He still fixed appliances in other people's houses. He still picked Ellie up from school and made dinner and managed the ongoing negotiation of bedtime, which Ellie treated as a suggestion rather than a policy. What changed was subtler. The feeling of the apartment, the weight of the evenings, the way Sunday mornings had become something with more people in them than the 2 of them had been for 3 years. He noticed it in the specific way you notice things that are better without necessarily anticipating how much better they could be. A second voice that asked the right questions, someone to hand a coffee to, the sound of the apartment containing more than just himself and his daughter moving through their routines. There were things that were not easy. Avery was not easy in the ways that mattered. She was exacting with herself in ways that sometimes bled into how she inhabited space, a quality of performance that she was slowly letting go of, but that showed up in moments, a precision that could read as distance when it wasn't meant to. There were evenings where she came back from the nonprofit in a mood that she carried without announcing and that required a certain patience to be around. She didn't apologize well. She acknowledged errors with a directness that sometimes skipped the parts of apology that were about the other person's feelings rather than the fact of the mistake. He was not without his own problems. He was still not a natural talker about things that were internal, still disposed toward action and logistics over language when the territory got uncertain. There was a week in December where Ellie had a hard stretch at school, a conflict with a friend that left her quiet in the evenings in a way that worried him, and he managed it badly for 3 days, too solution-oriented, not present enough in the feeling of it, before Avery said, gently and directly, "She doesn't need you to fix it. She needs you to sit with her in it." He did. It helped. He didn't thank Avery for the correction, which was its own version of the same problem she'd been working on. "You're allowed to say when I'm helpful," she said, a few nights later. "You were helpful," he said. "That wasn't so hard," she said. "It kind of was," he said. She looked at him, then she laughed, the real laugh that had become less rare, and he smiled, which was also a thing that happened more than it used to. In mid-December, the criminal charges against Damien Holt were formalized. 11 counts, including wire fraud, securities fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. His legal team was already attempting to negotiate, which the prosecutor's office was, according to the information that reached Avery through the company's legal counsel, approaching with limited enthusiasm given the quality of the evidence. Avery received this news on a Tuesday evening and said very little about it. She sat with it for a while in the way she sometimes sat with things, not avoiding, just processing in her own time. Later that night, after Ellie was asleep, she said, "I keep waiting to feel like it's over." What does it feel like? Like something that happened, not like something that's done. She looked at the ceiling. I spent 3 years building that company with him. You can't just... The bad part doesn't retroactively erase the real things that existed in there. No, he said, it doesn't. I don't know what to do with the real things. Nothing, he said. You carry them. You just decide what proportion of the weight is worth keeping. She looked at him. Is that what you do? With the Navy? He thought about it honestly. I don't know how to carry it evenly, he said. I carry too much of some parts and I've put down other parts I probably shouldn't have. I'm not a model for how to do it right. He paused. I just know that pretending the real things didn't exist doesn't work. I tried that. She was quiet for a moment. When? After Dana left. He looked at the wall. I decided that whatever had been real in that marriage was contaminated by how it ended. So I put it all down. And it turned out that doesn't actually work. You just end up carrying the absence of it, which is heavier. She turned to look at him fully. This was one of those moments where she was genuinely seeing him, not evaluating or reading, just looking. You don't talk about that very often. No. Because it's hard? Because it's boring, he said. Most personal failure is boring. It's the same wrong turns people make. It's not boring to the people who make the turns. No, he agreed. Not to them. She reached over, across the small distance between them on the couch, and put her hand over his. Not a gesture designed to mean something large. Just contact, the ordinary human kind that says, I'm here without requiring anything more precise than that. He turned his hand over. They sat like that for a while, with the rain outside and the apartment quiet, and Ellie asleep in the room down the hall, and none of it was particularly significant in the way that people expect significant things to look. It was just two imperfect people in the middle of a December evening, occupying the same space and choosing, without making a production of it, to keep occupying it. Christmas arrived with the full chaos that Christmas arrived with when a 7-year-old was involved. Ellie had opinions about the tree, which required negotiation. She had opinions about the lights, which required further negotiation. She had a school winter concert in which she played the triangle in what the program described as an ensemble performance, which she took with the seriousness of a featured soloist. She had a list that she had updated 4 times, and which had been communicated to both Nolan and Avery separately and in person with the apparent theory that redundancy improved outcomes. Avery bought Ellie a book, not just any book, but the 3rd volume of the Underground City series that Ellie had been waiting for since November, which required some research into how the series worked and whether the 3rd volume resolved anything important or simply set up Volume 4. She'd done this research, apparently, by reading a significant portion of Volumes 1 and 2 on a Tuesday evening, which Nolan discovered when he came into the living room at 11:30 and found her 40 pages from the end of Volume 2 with an expression that was caught between concentration and something that might have been mild embarrassment at being found reading a children's book at nearly midnight. In my defense, she said without looking up, the Underground City is genuinely interesting. He sat down. Is it? The cartography is internally consistent in a way that most children's fantasy doesn't bother with, she said. Also, the protagonist makes bad decisions for understandable reasons, which is, she paused, more interesting than protagonists who always do the right thing. He picked up his own book, which he was not 40 pages from the end of because he read more slowly and less fervently than she apparently did. Go back to the Underground City, he said. She did. On Christmas morning, Ellie opened the book and screamed, which was the correct response. And Avery received in return a drawing that Ellie had made in secret over the course of the previous week, which depicted the 3 of them, disproportionate in the way that Ellie's drawings always were, with large heads and small bodies, but recognizable and detailed in the specific details that mattered to Ellie. Nolan with his jacket, Avery with the laptop bag, Ellie herself between them with Biscuit under one arm. They were standing in the alley, which Ellie had learned about in fragments and had constructed in her imagination as a location of considerable drama. She'd drawn rain above them and what were either stars or very large puddles below. Above the drawing, in her careful second-grade handwriting, she'd written, "The night everything started." Avery held the drawing for a moment. She looked at it with her face doing the thing it still did. The specific unguarded shift that happened when Ellie said or gave something that landed before Avery could manage it. She set it on her lap and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Where did you get started from?" Nolan said to Ellie. Ellie shrugged with the unconcerned authority of someone reporting a fact. "Because it did," she said. "Everything started then, so I wanted to draw it." Avery looked at Nolan over Ellie's head. He looked back. The drawing was in her lap, and the morning was outside the apartment windows doing the pale December thing it did, and whatever was between them. The thing that had been building through 11 days of running and 5 days of preparation and a boardroom and an elevator and a Sunday kitchen and a couch at 11:30 and everything that had happened between and around all of those things sat in the room with them like something that had always been meant to be there, waiting for the people in the room to catch up to it. "Merry Christmas," Ellie said, apparently satisfied with the scene. "Merry Christmas," Avery said. Her voice was even. Her eyes were not, quite. Nolan put his hand briefly on Ellie's head, the way he did when she'd done something that didn't have a proportionate response, when the right thing was just a small acknowledgement rather than anything large. Outside, the December rain had stopped, which it did sometimes, without warning, and left the city briefly clear. 18 months is long enough to stop counting. That was the thing Nolan noticed first. Not any single event, not a conversation or a morning or a moment he could point to, but the simple fact that somewhere between the January after Christmas and the following spring he had stopped tracking time the way he'd tracked it in the year after Dana left, when every month had felt like a unit of endurance rather than just a unit of living. The counting stopped. The weeks became weeks rather than evidence of something survived. This was not a small thing, even if it arrived without announcement. The apartment had changed in the way that spaces change when they're genuinely inhabited rather than just occupied. Small accumulations that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Avery's coffee grinder on the counter beside the machine. A second row of books on the shelf that reflected a different mind than the one that had arranged the first row. A chart of the dinosaur family tree that Ellie had drawn, and Avery had helped her label taxonomically, taped to the wall beside the kitchen table with the same strips of blue painter's tape Ellie used for everything, which left marks that Nolan never removed because the marks were proof that something had been there. Ellie was 8 now, then 8.5. She had grown without Nolan entirely registering how, the way children grow when you're in the same house, imperceptibly, continuously, until one morning you're looking at her across the breakfast table, and she is measurably a different person than the one you were looking at 6 months ago, and you can't identify the moment of change because there wasn't one. There were just days, stacked. She had adjusted to the new shape of things, with the practicality that had always been her particular gift. Avery was in the apartment, and then Avery was consistently in the apartment, and then Avery was the person who helped with math homework on the evenings when Nolan's brain was too tired for fractions, and who kept a dedicated section of the refrigerator shelf that Ellie had labeled with a piece of masking tape reading "Avery's things do not eat," which Ellie had applied not as a restriction on herself but as a service to Avery, explaining that this way Avery would always know where her yogurt was. These were the textures of a life. Not a perfect one. Not the kind you'd construct from scratch if you were designing for comfort, but a real one with the particular substance of things that have been tested and are still standing. The nonprofit work had changed Avery in ways she was still in the process of understanding. Francis Cho ran the organization, called the Groundwork Collective, with the focused pragmatism of someone who had spent 20 years watching well-intentioned programs fail because they were designed by people who understood poverty theoretically but not structurally. What Francis needed, and what she'd told Avery directly in their first meeting, was someone who could walk into a small business and diagnose the difference between a cash flow problem and a pricing problem and a demand problem, because those three things looked identical from the outside and required completely different interventions, and most consultants couldn't tell them apart. Avery could tell them apart. She'd been telling them apart since she was 23 years old and running a consulting company out of a rented server and a corner of a co-working space in Belltown, surviving on the fact that she was right more often than she was wrong and honest about it when she wasn't. What she hadn't anticipated was how much it would matter that the people she was helping were not abstractions. Terrence and his construction business. A woman named Luce who ran a cleaning service and had built it to 14 employees through sheer force of will, and was now in danger of losing it because her invoicing system had created a tax liability she didn't know existed. A 26-year-old named Marcus, who had a food truck that was genuinely excellent and a pricing model that was killing him, who sat across from Avery in the Groundwork Collective's small conference room with the expression of someone who expected to be told he was failing and received instead a spreadsheet that showed him exactly which 3 adjustments would make the business viable. "That's it?" Marcus said, looking at the spreadsheet. "That's most of it," Avery said. "The rest is volume, and you'll build that." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight and has just been shown that part of it wasn't real. "I thought I was done," he said. "I thought I was going to have to close it." "You're not close to done," she said. "You were just operating on bad information." She drove home that evening and sat in the car in the parking lot behind the apartment building for 4 minutes before going up, not because anything was wrong, but because she needed the 4 minutes to feel the specific weight of the day, not to manage it or analyze it, just to feel it. This was new for her. She had spent most of her adult life moving too fast to stop inside a moment. The nonprofit operated at a pace that occasionally frustrated her, and that she was slowly learning was actually the correct pace for the work being done. When she went upstairs, Nolan was making dinner, and Ellie was at the table with the Underground City series, which she was on her 3rd read-through of because the first 2 had not fully resolved her questions about the cartographic inconsistency between volumes 2 and 3. And Avery came in and set her bag down, and Nolan handed her a glass of water without being asked, and Ellie said without looking up, "Avery, I found the inconsistency." "The cartographic one?" "Volume 2 says the eastern tunnels connect to the main chamber from the left side, but in Volume 3 the map shows them connecting from the right." She looked up. "Which is the mistake?" "Volume 3, Avery said. "The author forgot to flip the orientation when she redrew the map for the new publisher." Ellie stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I emailed the author in January." Ellie's expression went through several stages. You emailed the author?" "I had the same question in January. I was further into Volume 2 than I'd told anyone." "What did she say?" "She said Volume 3 was the mistake, and that she'd noticed it too late to correct it in the first printing, and that the second printing has the correction." Ellie looked at her book, then back at Avery. "We have the first printing." "I know. I ordered the second printing. It's coming Thursday." The expression on Ellie's face was one Nolan had seen before. It was the expression she got when someone did something that precisely matched what she needed without her having said what she needed. It was a form of being known that children recognized before they had language for it. She got up from the table and hugged Avery around the middle with the particular force of someone for whom hugging was a full contact activity. Avery stood still for a moment in the specific way she still occasionally stood still when Ellie's affection arrived. Not stiff, not uncomfortable, but adjusting, the way someone adjusts to a temperature they haven't learned yet is safe. Then her arms came down and she held Ellie back, properly, the way she'd learned to over 18 months of being held. Nolan turned back to the stove. He didn't need to watch the rest of it. The criminal case against Damien resolved in February of the following year. He took a plea agreement that his lawyers had negotiated for 4 months, 7 years, with the possibility of parole at 5, plus full restitution of the embezzled funds, plus a permanent bar from serving in any executive or fiduciary capacity. The $11.4 million was in the process of being recovered from the various accounts and shell structures his lawyers had spent 2 months mapping. Avery received the news on a Tuesday morning via a call from the company's legal counsel. She was at the Groundwork Collective between meetings, standing in the small hallway outside the conference room with a cup of the office's terrible coffee. She listened to the summary, asked 2 clarifying questions, thanked the attorney, and hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment. She had thought, for a long time, that the end of the legal case would feel like something significant, like a door closing, or like the particular release that comes when a weight you've been carrying has been officially set down. What she felt instead was quieter and less defined than that. Not anticlimax, just completion, in the modest, undramatic way that most things actually complete, not a door closing. More like a light being turned off in a room you'd left some time ago and had been meaning to switch off on your way out. She called Nolan. "It's done," she said. A pause. "How are you?" I'm okay. She thought about it. I'm actually okay. Not performing okay, actually. Good, he said. Are you coming home for lunch? Home. He used the word the way people used words they'd stopped examining, which meant it had been the word for long enough that it no longer needed to announce itself. Yes, she said. I'll be there by noon. She went back into the conference room where Luce was waiting with her updated tax documentation and a new concern about her workers' classification status that had emerged from the last round of filings. Avery sat down and looked at the documents and got back to work because the case against Damien was resolved, but Luce's business was still in the process of being saved, and of the two things, only one required her attention right now. The question Ellie asked was on a Saturday in March, 18 months and 3 weeks after the night in the alley. It was not a dramatic moment. This was the thing about children. They asked the questions that adults spent years circling at the moments when adults were least prepared for them. Not because children were strategically inclined, but because children asked what they were thinking when they were thinking it, without the buffer of social calculation. They were in the kitchen. Nolan was replacing a hinge on the cabinet door that had been sticking for 2 months, a thing that happened when you were the person who fixed other people's appliances and therefore never quite got around to your own. And Avery was at the table with her laptop doing something for the Groundwork Collective, and Ellie was eating cereal at 10:30 in the morning because Saturday was the day of late breakfast, and she had negotiated this policy into existence over a period of several months until it was simply the way things were. She finished her cereal. She looked at Nolan's back. She looked at Avery. She said, "When are you going to be an official family?" The cabinet hinge made a small sound. Nolan didn't turn around immediately. Avery looked up from the laptop. "What do you mean by official?" she said. Ellie set her spoon in the bowl with the careful precision of someone who has thought about this and is delivering a considered position. "Like, you live here, and Dad lives here, and I live here, and we eat dinner together, and we do Saturday things together, and Avery came to my school thing, and you know where everything is." She gestured at the apartment in a way that encompassed all of it. "But Maisie asked me if Avery was my mom, and I didn't know what to say." The kitchen was quiet, in the particular way it got quiet when something real had been said. Nolan turned around. He looked at Ellie, then at Avery. Avery was looking at Ellie with the unguarded expression, the one that still arrived before she could manage it. The one Nolan had watched develop over 18 months from a rare occurrence into something closer to her default when Ellie was involved. "What did you want to say?" she asked. "When Maisie asked?" Ellie thought about this with the seriousness she brought to genuine questions. "I wanted to say yes," she said, "but I didn't know if that was right." Avery looked at her for a long moment, then she looked at Nolan. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking back at her with the steady, direct quality that was simply how he looked at things he was certain about, which was rarer than it might appear from the outside, and which she had learned to recognize as something distinct from his other expressions. "I think," Avery said, turning back to Ellie, "that families get made in a lot of different ways. Some of them have a specific official moment, and some of them just become over time through all the ordinary things. Dinner, homework, messing up, and trying again." She paused. "I think we might already be a family. I'm just not sure we've said it out loud yet." Ellie looked at her father. "Is that true?" "Yeah," Nolan said. "I think that's true." Ellie absorbed this. Then, "But could you also do the official part because I want to know what to tell Maisie?" The cabinet hinge made no sound this time because Nolan wasn't touching it anymore. He was looking at Avery with the expression of a man who is about to say something that has been true for a while and is only now finding the exact right moment to say it, which is the way these things usually work. Not in grand orchestrated gestures, but in the small, ordinary moments that are somehow also the only moments that are large enough. "Avery," he said. "I know," she said. Quiet. "Sure. I'm not good at the speech part of this," he said. "I know that too. But I'm asking." She looked at him. This man who had walked into an alley on an instinct and had not walked away from what the alley led to, who had made room in his closet and his kitchen and his life without making it a negotiation. who had prepared her for a boardroom the way he would have prepared a member of his team, not to perform competence, but to be it, who had told her the true things without dressing them up, who had sat with her in the hard silences and not tried to fix them. This man who was imperfect in specific ways she now knew by name, too internal, too slow to say the soft thing, still carrying parts of the Navy that showed up in how he moved through uncertain spaces, still learning that the people who loved him needed to hear it occasionally rather than only feel it. This man who had a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, who had offered a stranger her second favorite stuffed animal within 10 minutes of meeting her and had been right to. Yes, Avery said. Ellie looked between them. Then she looked at the ceiling in the way she did when she was processing something significant. Then she got down from the chair, carried her cereal bowl to the sink with the careful responsibility she applied to her kitchen tasks, rinsed it, and set it in the drying rack. Okay, she said, to no one in particular. I'll tell Maisie. She went to find her book. They married in May, on a Saturday, in the small backyard of a rented house in the Finney Ridge neighborhood because the apartment didn't have a backyard, and they'd wanted something with trees. It was not a large wedding. Gerald Foss came, which surprised Avery, and which she did not entirely know how to categorize, except as a gesture that she appreciated more than she said. Frances Cho came with her husband. A woman from Nolan's old Navy unit drove down from Bellingham and stood near the back and cried without apparent embarrassment. Patricia Ewan sent flowers and a note that said, in her particular economical style, "You built it right." This included Sonia, who had made the call that had made the board meeting possible, brought wine and left early, and that was exactly correct. Ellie wore a yellow dress of her own choosing, which she had described to the woman at the dress shop in sufficient detail that the woman had found it on the third try, and she carried flowers that she had also selected independently, and she stood beside Avery during the ceremony with the concentrated seriousness of someone who understood that this was important and intended to be present for it. The ceremony was short because neither Nolan nor Avery was interested in ceremony for its own sake. They said the things that were true. The person officiating said the things that needed saying. They signed the documents. The small group of people who loved them, in the various ways people love each other and the families they make, stood in the May afternoon light and witnessed it. Afterward, Ellie pulled Nolan aside near the table with the cake on it, which she had also had opinions about, specifically that it should involve lemon, which it did, and said, with the focused gravity of someone delivering a formal report, "I like today." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." "Avery cried a little during the part where you were talking," Ellie said. "Did you notice?" "I noticed. She didn't want anyone to see, but I could see because I was standing right next to her." "What did you do?" "I held her hand," Ellie said. Nolan looked at his daughter in her yellow dress with her selected flowers and felt the thing he sometimes felt in moments that were too large for the vocabulary available to him. The imprecise, inarticulable weight of a life that had arrived at something worth having. Not because everything had gone right, but because enough things had been held on to through what went wrong. He put his hand on her head the way he did when she'd done something that had no proportionate response. "Good call," he said. "Bet." The spring and then the summer arranged themselves into the ordinary business of a family's life, which is to say, imperfect and varied and full of the small frictions that are inseparable from people sharing space and time and the daily project of being known by each other. The apartment on Pike had been exchanged for a rented house in Ballard, not large, but with a yard and an extra room that became Ellie's, with an attention to its decoration that reflected her current preoccupations, which were the Underground City series, the Parasaurolophus, and a new interest in astronomy that had arrived without warning. One evening, when Nolan had pointed out Orion through the apartment window, and Ellie had asked 17 consecutive questions that neither of them could fully answer. There was a telescope now, second-hand, that they'd set up in the backyard on the clearest evenings, and that Ellie used with the intensity she brought to things that held her interest. Nolan still drove the white van. This surprised some people who learned it, who learned that the man who had kept a CEO safe from corporate hired men and had stood in a boardroom while someone's career was dismantled by the evidence he'd helped protect was still going out to fix dishwashers and refrigerators in other people's houses. And didn't surprise him at all. The work was honest. It required attention and competence and left things in better condition than it found them. He was not interested in work that didn't have those qualities, and he'd made enough money as a Navy SEAL to know that the amount of money you made was mostly a signal other people used to determine how much to respect you, which was not a signal he'd ever found useful for anything. He was, if he was honest, good at his life in the way he'd once been good at other things. Not flashily, not in a way that generated attention, but with a solidity that came from knowing what the work required and providing it. He came home in the evenings and made dinner and helped Ellie with the questions that had 17 consecutive parts, and sat on the back porch sometimes after Ellie was in bed and drank his coffee in the night air without needing anything to be different than it was. This was not nothing. He'd learned that a long time ago, and the learning hadn't made it smaller. Avery had a hard autumn. The Groundwork Collective expanded. Francis brought in 2 new staff and a larger grant from a foundation that had been watching their outcomes data with interest. And Avery's role grew in ways that were good, and that also required more of her than the previous version had. There was a month in October where she was traveling 2 days a week to work with a cohort of small businesses in Tacoma that Francis had taken on, and the travel compressed the time she had at home and made everything feel slightly out of sync. She was short with Nolan twice in that month, in ways she didn't mean to be. The specific shortness of someone who is using the people closest to them as the place where pressure releases, because those are the people safe enough to absorb it. The first time she caught herself doing it and apologized that evening in the direct way she'd always had, without decoration. The second time she didn't catch it, and Nolan said something about it the next morning in the straightforward way he'd developed for saying things that needed saying. Not accusatory, not wounded, just factual and clear. And she sat with the discomfort of being named accurately for the rest of that day. "I'm doing the thing," she said that evening. "I know," he said. "The pressure release thing." "Yeah. I don't know how to not do it when I'm this stretched." "You could tell me you're stretched," he said, "before it comes out sideways. It's easier for me to work with than trying to figure out what I did." She looked at him. "You didn't do anything." "I know, but when it comes out sideways, I don't know that." She was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "I'm sorry." "I know." He looked at her. "Are you okay?" "I'm tired," she said. "Productive tired. I'm not unhappy. I keep thinking I've learned how to manage my capacity, and then I find out I haven't." "Nobody learns that," he said. "You just keep recalibrating." "Have you recalibrated?" "Several times," he said. "Usually after I've done something that told me the previous calibration was wrong." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been given a small, useful piece of information and intends to keep it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. This was how they handled things. Not perfectly. Not without the friction that came from 2 people who had each been managing their own lives for long enough that the habits of that management had set in. Who had to consciously choose, repeatedly, and without it ever becoming automatic, to let another person into the space where decisions were made. It required effort. The effort was worth making. These were 2 different things that were both consistently true. Ellie turned 9 in November, and the party was small by design and large in practice, because Ellie's friendships had expanded to the point where small was a relative term. Maisie was there, and 3 other girls from school, and a boy named Oscar who had a complicated social situation that Ellie had described to Avery over 2 evenings in considerable detail, arriving at the conclusion that Oscar should be invited because excluding him would be unkind, and unkindness was not an acceptable reason to simplify logistics. Avery had made the cake this year. This was a new development and not an unqualified success. The layers were not entirely level, and the frosting had been applied with more enthusiasm than precision, but it was chocolate, which was what Ellie wanted, and it tasted correct, which was the important thing. "It looks like it's thinking about falling over," Ellie said, examining it. "It's not going to fall over," Avery said. "How do you know?" "Because I used enough frosting between the layers to structurally reinforce it. The frosting is load-bearing." Ellie looked at Nolan. "Is that how cakes work?" "In this house," he said. "Apparently, yes." The cake did not fall over. The party was loud in the specific way of 9-year-olds who have been given sugar and a yard to use, and Avery stood at the kitchen window watching it with her coffee and her unleveled cake on the counter, and felt the specific, non-transferable satisfaction of someone who has stopped being in a hurry to be somewhere else. Opa. The thing about people who have been through something is that the something doesn't leave. It becomes part of the structure rather than part of the story. Built in, load-bearing in its own way, invisible from the outside but present in everything that gets placed on top of it. Nolan still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with the particular alertness that had no object. That was just the body remembering old vigilance in the quiet of a house where nothing needed protecting right now. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and let the alertness subside on its own schedule, which took less time than it used to. He was better at this than he'd been. Not cured of it, there was no curing, that wasn't how it worked, but better at sitting inside it without fighting it, which turned out to be the faster way through. Avery still had the moments where she was calculating rather than present, where her mind ran out ahead into problem assessment and scenario mapping while the actual moment was still happening, which was a habit so deeply formed it showed up even in the safest of contexts, even in a kitchen on a Sunday or a backyard on a clear enough night. She was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, better at noticing when it was happening and making the choice to come back to where she actually was. These things did not make them tragic. They made them specific. They made them themselves rather than placeholders for what people wanted love stories to look like. The real version was messier and quieter and more demanding and more substantial than the version people told in outlines. It involved an impractical number of conversations about small things and a few conversations about very large things and the ongoing negotiation of two people who were each carrying the residue of their own histories into a shared present and having to decide repeatedly whether to set the residue down or carry it together. They mostly chose together. Not always. Mostly. Yes. On a clear night in December, the 2nd December of the house in Ballard, Ellie set up the telescope in the backyard after dinner and announced that there was a conjunction of 2 planets visible that her astronomy book had mentioned, and that she intended to observe it. They all went out. The temperature was cold enough to matter and not cold enough to stop them, and Ellie found the planets with the focused, methodical patience that she applied to things she cared about. And when she had them in the eyepiece, she stepped back and said, "You can look." Nolan looked. 2 points of light, close together in the dark. Distinct but proximate. He stepped back. Avery looked. She was quiet for a moment, then stepped back. "What are they doing?" Ellie asked. "Just moving," Avery said. "They appear close from here, but they're actually very far apart. We're just at the angle where they look like they're together." Ellie thought about this. "So they're not really close." "Not in terms of actual distance, but from where we're standing, they're as close as they get." Ellie looked through the eyepiece again. Then she looked up at the sky without it, at the wide dark above the Ballard rooftops with its particular scatter of winter stars. "I think from where you're standing is real," she said, "even if it's not the only real." Nolan looked at Avery over the top of Ellie's head. Avery looked back. Ellie had not meant this as a profound statement. She had meant it as an observation about astronomy, which it also was. But the thing about children who are paying attention is that they sometimes say the thing that the adults around them have been trying to articulate for months, without knowing that's what they're doing, simply because they haven't learned yet to be afraid of saying the true thing plainly. From where you're standing is real, even if it's not the only real. Nolan put his arm around Avery's shoulders in the cold December backyard, and she leaned into it in the way she'd learned to lean into things. Not easily, but genuinely, which was better than easy. And Ellie moved on to locating the next item on her astronomy list, narrating her progress aloud in the focused whisper she used when she was concentrating. The stars were where they'd always been. The city around them was doing what cities did. The house behind them had lights on in 2 of the windows, and the kitchen visible through the back door, with the slightly uneven cake plate still on the counter from Ellie's birthday 2 weeks ago because nobody had put it away yet, which was the kind of small domestic imperfection that accumulated in real households, and that Nolan had stopped seeing as disorder and had started seeing as evidence. Evidence of dinners, evidence of mornings, evidence of the specific, unremarkable accumulation of days that turned out, when you looked at it from the right angle, to be the actual thing, the real architecture of what a life was built from. Not the alley, though that was where it started. Not the boardroom, though that was where something was proven. Not any single moment of courage or clarity or decision, just this. The backyard and the telescope and the cold and the kid narrating her discoveries into the dark, and two imperfect people standing in it together, choosing, as they had kept choosing and would keep choosing, to stay where they were. There is a version of this story that gets told as a rescue. Man saves woman. Woman saves herself. Child saves both of them without knowing it. It's not the wrong version, but it's not the whole one. The whole one is harder to tell because it doesn't have the clean shape of a rescue. It has the shape of ordinary time, the kind that moves slowly and changes things and costs something and gives something back in a currency you can't always name, but that you feel in the specific weight of a house that is genuinely inhabited, in the sound of a kid asking the right question at the wrong moment, in the knowledge, earned rather than assumed, that the person beside you has seen the unremarkable version of you and chosen it anyway. That's the thing nobody tells you about being found. It's not the moment in the alley. It's the morning after and the morning after that, and all the ordinary mornings that follow, the ones where you show up imperfectly and stay anyway, where you let yourself be known in the unglamorous specifics rather than only in the crisis, where you discover that the life you'd been building toward was not the one you'd planned, but the one that was being built around you while you were paying attention to something else. Nolan Cross had left a war to raise his daughter and had found, unexpectedly, and at the cost of walking into a dark alley on a rainy November night, something he hadn't known he was missing. Not peace. He'd never been fully at peace and probably never would be, and he'd made a certain amount of terms with that. Something more like completeness. The sense that the structure of his life, which had been functional and real and genuinely worth living, now also had the specific quality of a structure that is inhabited by the right number of people. Avery Monroe had built something, lost it, fought to reclaim it, and then stood at the edge of reclaiming it and chosen differently. She had chosen smaller and truer, which turned out to be larger than anything she'd had before, which was the kind of math that didn't make sense until you were inside it. She was still learning to stop calculating when the moment didn't require calculation. She was still learning that a life wasn't a problem to be solved, but a thing to be lived in, with all the discomfort and surprise and ungovernable love that living in things required. Ellie Cross, who would be Ellie Cross. Avery Monroe Cross on the school forms starting in January, a name long enough that her teacher asked about it, and she explained the whole thing with a thoroughness that apparently moved the teacher to tears, though Ellie reported this detail with more puzzlement than sentiment, was 9 years old and had never stopped being exactly who she was, which was the most impressive thing about her. She knew before either of the adults did that they were already a family. She'd just been waiting for them to catch up. "I found it," she said, stepping back from the telescope. "Come look." They looked. Whatever it was, another planet, a star, something the astronomy book had named, and she had located through patience and attention and the willingness to keep adjusting the angle until the thing she was looking for came clear. It was there, small and bright, and exactly where it was supposed to be. "What is it?" Avery asked. "It's us," Ellie said, which made no scientific sense and made complete sense, and neither of the adults corrected her, because some things are true in a way that doesn't require accuracy. The night was cold and clear, and the three of them stood in it together, and that was enough. And that was everything, and that was the whole story, told from the only angle that ever really mattered. The one where you're standing close enough to see the light,